This painting depicts a group of men in suits and caps waving at a crowd while walking on a red carpet. A few of them hold little red books. A white fence and train are on the right side of the painting, and rows of tiered people behind a short, ornate white wall are cheering. Figure 14. 1 Mao Zedong. This 1967 artist's rendering of Mao Zedong greeting a cheering Chinese public during the Cultural Revolution shows loyal party members following him and holding the little red book that contained his most popular sayings. Credit, modification of work, 1967-11, 1967 oil painting of Mao Zedong reviewing the Red Guards, by China Pictorial 1967/Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. Chapter outline 14. 1. The Cold War begins 14. 2. The spread of communism 14. 3. The non-aligned movement 14. 4. Global tensions and decolonization 14. 5. A new world order in the period following World War II. Leaders like Joseph Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and Mao Zedong of China, figure 14. 1. Believed communism would light the way to a bright new future for humankind. The United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western countries regarded communism as a threat to freedom, instead placing their faith in capitalism and democracy to improve human life. The ideological differences between these two groups of countries and the global-scale struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States for social, economic, technological, and military supremacy divided the world into mutually hostile spheres in the half-century following the war. Their antagonism played out in a real but bloodless conflict known as the Cold War. A timeline of key events covered in this chapter is shown. 1945, Vietnam declares independence. 1947, Marshall Plan provides aid in Europe, and civil war breaks out in Greece. A poster showing two men running away from a very tall man in a white outfit holding a poster above his head with Greek writing is shown. 1948, Israel founded. A picture of a man standing at a table speaking to others seated all around the room at tables is shown. June 1948, Berlin airlift begins. A photograph of an airplane flying low with a large group of people standing on the ground is shown. 1948, apartheid formalized. 1949, NATO founded. 1956, Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. 1957, Sputnik orbits Earth. A photograph of a round object with 4 rays coming off of it is shown. 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. An aerial image of missile positions is shown. 1975, Angolan Civil War begins. 1978, Deng Xiaoping becomes leader of China. A photograph of 2 men is shown. Figure 14. 2 Timeline. Cold War conflicts. Credit, 1947, Civil War breaks out in Greece. Modification of work, 1946 Greece Pro Royal poster by www. Books Journal. gr/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1948. Israel founded. Modification of work, Declaration of State of Israel 1948 by Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, June 1948. Modification of work, Berliners watching a C-54 land at Berlin Tempelhof Airport, 1948, by Henry Rise/U. S. Air Force/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1957. Modification of work, a replica of Sputnik 1 by NSSDC/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1962. Modification of work, Cuba Missiles Crisis U-2FO, by the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit, 1978. Modification of work, Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter at the arrival ceremony for the Vice Premier of China, by U.S. National Archives and Records Administration/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. A world map is shown. The countries of Belgium, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Canada, and the United States are highlighted yellow and labeled founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. 1949. The countries of Albania, the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania are highlighted purple and labeled founding members of the Warsaw Pact, 1955. The People's Republic of China in 1949 is also labeled. Figure 14. 3 Locator Map, Cold War Conflicts. Credit, Modification of Work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the origins of the Cold War, analyze the effectiveness of the Truman Doctrine, explain how U.S. foreign policy sought to prevent the spread of communism after World War II, discuss the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Warsaw Pact following the surrender of Germany in May 1945. The Big Three, allied nations of the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, began the massive task of recovering from the European phase of World War II. However, by no means did they agree on the manner in which to do so, and their differences in goals and political ideology threatened to plunge the world back into conflict almost as soon as it had emerged from it. The superpowers divided in the summer of 1945, the world looked much different from the way it had 5 years before. Of all the great powers, only the United States had been relatively unaffected by World War II. Its territory and national infrastructure remained intact, its economy was strong, and its civilian population had gone unharmed. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, while badly bloodied, had also emerged relatively whole. Its immense size and population had spared it the scale of destruction suffered by the rest of Europe. Britain, though pounded by German air raids, had escaped invasion, but it had been severely weakened by the war and could no longer be the world leader it had been. It was about to be superseded by the United States and the Soviet Union, whose ideological differences shaped the post-war world. Post-war goals. The United States and the Soviet Union each saw themselves as the rightful leader of the world emerging from the ashes of the war. Although they had united to defeat Hitler, their deep-seated differences now returned to the fore. For the United States, the ideal world was one in which democratically governed nations would coexist peacefully, enjoying economic prosperity thanks to capitalistic endeavors. In the Soviet Union's vision of the future, communism would lead the world's countries to a peaceful, prosperous future, and it would never again fear invasion from the lands to its west. The latter goal was the reason Stalin insisted on establishing satellite states in Eastern Europe, countries the Soviet Union would control by installing communist, pro-Soviet governments within them. At the Moscow Conference of 1944, which U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt did not attend, Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed to let Stalin install Soviet-allied communist parties to control the governments of Romania and Bulgaria, which had been German allies during the war. In exchange, Stalin promised to leave control of the Balkans to the British. By the time the victorious allies met in Potsdam in the summer of 1945 to finalize plans to partition Germany and its capital city of Berlin, Churchill no longer wished Stalin to exercise so much power in Eastern Europe. He warned the new U.S. president, Harry Truman, who was unaware of what had been agreed to at the Moscow Conference, of the danger of allowing the Soviets to control the region. But Stalin then consolidated his grip on Eastern Europe by placing a pro-Soviet government in power in Poland. In March 1946, in a speech in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill warned his audience that an Iron Curtain had cut Europe in two, trapping half the continent under Soviet domination. This division of the world into United States, Allied and Soviet-allied, halves characterized the Cold War, a contest for ideological, social, economic, technological, and military supremacy that lasted until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The war was cold because it did not include actual fighting between U.S. and Soviet forces. A hot war is a conflict in which countries engage in armed conflict with one another. The splintering of Europe that Churchill described deepened in 1948, when a government composed of both communists and non-communists in Czechoslovakia was toppled and replaced by an all-communist government loyal to Moscow. In 1949, Hungary also came under the control of a communist party closely allied with the Soviet Union. The chief strategy of the United States in the Cold War was containment, an effort to confine Soviet influence to Eastern Europe. Containment was first mentioned by George F. Kennan, a U.S. diplomat stationed in Moscow, in a message to the State Department known as the Long Telegram. Kennan described the Soviet government as paranoid and committed to a war against capitalism. Soviet leaders, he believed, could not be moved by reason and understood only force. Their attempts to spread communism must thus be met with strong resistance. Link to learning, read the text of George Kennan's Long Telegram to the U.S. Department of State. The foreign policy goals of the Soviet Union following World War II were directly opposed to those of the United States. The USSR sought to protect itself and bolster its economy by strengthening its control over the communist states of Eastern Europe. It also encouraged communist revolution in other countries and maintained close ties with communist parties throughout the world. The Soviet Union regarded itself as the chief opponent of European and U.S. imperialism, and in this role, it supported independence movements in colonies in Asia and Africa. To the Soviet leadership, the United States was an aggressor nation bent upon world domination, and the spread of communism reduced the threat of future wars. To protect its own interests and those of its allies, the Soviet Union needed to be militarily and technologically superior. The Truman Doctrine, the first test of U.S. resolve to counter the forces of communism, came in 1947 in an unexpected place: Greece. During World War II, resistance to the German army occupying Greece had come from both supporters of the country's Communist Party and loyalists of its monarchical government. In 1944, shortly after the withdrawal of the Germans, the occupying British forces and Prime Minister George Papandreou, who had returned from exile, jointly called for the disarmament of these resistance groups, and violence erupted. In 1946, following the triumph of monarchists, in an election the Greek communists boycotted, civil war broke out. Communist forces sought the overthrow of King George II and his government, Figure 14. To prevent this, Britain provided the government with economic and military assistance, an extension of the aid it had given during the war. In 1947, however, Britain announced that it would no longer do so, most likely because it was experiencing economic problems. A poster shows an overly tall man in a long white shirt, black beaded vest, red belt, white leggings, and red tasseled shoes holding a sign above his head with Greek lettering. Two smaller men, one in brown clothing dropping a knife from his bloody fingers, the other dressed in a red shirt with the letters KK and black pants, flee from the large man with anger and fear showing on their faces. There is text in Greek across the bottom of the poster. Figure 14, for civil war in Greece. This anti-communist poster encouraged Greeks to support King George II in the 1940s Greek Civil War. Credit: Modification of work, 1946 Greece Pro-Royal poster by www. Books Journal. gr/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The events in Greece worried the U.S. government. Neighboring Turkey was regarded as the gateway to the Middle East and its crucial supplies of petroleum, upon which Western industry and transportation depended. Truman feared that, should Greece become a communist country, a communist uprising might occur in neighboring Turkey as well. This belief that the neighbors of communist countries would in turn become communist themselves is known as the domino theory. Both the United Kingdom and the United States were wary of Soviet activity in this region. In 1946, the Soviet Union had demanded that Turkey allow it to take shipping through Turkish-controlled straits from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. When Turkey refused, the Soviets increased their naval presence in the Black Sea and sent troops to the Balkans. The Soviet Union backed down and withdrew its forces when the U.S. bolstered its own naval presence in the region. The showdown in Turkey was the second time the post-war Soviet Union had found itself in conflict with its former allies. Earlier, it had violated an agreement to withdraw from Iran, which it had occupied along with the British during World War II. By an agreed-upon date the British had honored. Truman now feared the Greek communists were not acting alone and that the Soviet Union was active in the country. However, Truman was mistaken in assuming all communists acted under the direction of the Soviet Union. the communist governments of Albania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia extended aid to the Greek communists, but most evidence indicates that the Soviet Union did not. The Soviets were largely uninterested in Greece, and at the Moscow Conference of 1944, Stalin had given control of Greece to Britain in exchange for the concessions that allowed him to decide the fate of Romania and Bulgaria. There is little to suggest that Stalin violated this agreement about Greece until the United States got involved. Once the fate of Greece became of interest to Truman, Stalin took note of it as well. On March 12, 1947, Truman addressed Congress and requested aid for the governments of Greece and Turkey. He framed the appeal as part of the struggle against communism and argued that it was the duty of the United States to oppose totalitarian regimes. Congress approved his request for $400 million, approximately $5 billion in today's money. The president's pledge to help free peoples resist communist expansion, a promise that became known as the Truman Doctrine, formed the basis of U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Following the proclamation of the Truman Doctrine, Stalin channeled material support for the Civil War to Greece's communists, but covertly. The Marshall Plan, the U.S. effort to combat the expansion of communism, also led to the creation of the European Recovery Program, named the Marshall Plan for Secretary of State George C. Marshall. In 1947, Marshall called for economic assistance to rebuild post-war Europe. Realizing the attractions of communism to impoverished, war-ravaged Europeans, Congress approved the Economic Cooperation Act in 1948 to pump an eventual total of $12 billion into Europe's economy, about $147 billion today. The funds were vital in assisting Western Europe as a whole to rebuild their infrastructure and restore their industrial capacity. Because necessary materials often needed to be purchased from the United States, aid given through the Marshall Plan also helped ensure that the U.S. economy did not slide into an economic depression now that the war had ended. U.S. aid was offered to all European nations, including Germany and the Soviet Union. Stalin, however, rejected it and forbade Eastern Europe's communist-governed states within the Soviet sphere of influence to accept it. Instead, the USSR proposed the Molotov Plan, which gave aid to and established trade agreements with the communist nations of Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet zone in Germany that later became the German Democratic Republic, commonly known as East Germany. Finally, in 1949, the United States developed the Point 4 program to provide technical assistance to industrializing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia for improving their standard of living. Western and Eastern blocks the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that had built up slowly through the later 1940s came to a head in 1948. Believing a strong Germany was vital to Europe's economic recovery and a necessary bulwark against the spread of communism, the United States, Britain, and France planned to reunify the three zones of Germany they had occupied since the end of World War II. United, these zones would dwarf the Soviet zone in size, population, and wealth, and by sharing a single currency, play a major role in Europe's post-war economy. The Soviet Union hoped to keep Germany disunited and weak, and thus objected. In March 1948, it withdrew from the Allied Control Council that coordinated Allied actions in Germany. In June, the United Kingdom and the United States introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their zones as well as into the western portions of Berlin they controlled, in order to dispense Marshall Plan funds. Infuriated, the Soviet Union cut off all ground routes into West Berlin. No food or fuel could enter the city by road, railroad, or canal. The Soviets planned to starve the Western Allies out, forcing them to abandon their sections of Berlin and thus their toehold within the Soviet zone. Realizing that air was their only way around the blockade, the United Kingdom and the United States swiftly formulated plans to supply the besieged city by plane. For nearly a year, they carried out the Berlin Airlift, an extensive operation that at one point had a British or U.S. plane taking off from Berlin's Tempelhof Airport every 45 seconds, figure 14. 5. Recognizing they could not defeat the resolve of the Western Allies, the Soviets ended the blockade in May 1949. 2 weeks later, the Western Allies unified their occupation zones to form the new country of the Federal Republic of Germany, usually referred to as West Germany, with the city of Bonn as its capital. A photograph shows a cargo airplane with 2 propellers on each wing and its landing wheels down, flying closely over a large crowd of people. Men, women, and children are standing on a hill as the plane passes above them. Figure 14. 5 Berlin Airlift. Residents of West Berlin watch as a U.S. cargo plane bearing crucial supplies lands at Tempelhof Airport in 1948. Credit: Berliners watching a C-54 land at Berlin Tempelhof Airport, 1948, by Henry Rise/U.S. Air Force/Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. The Western Allies then took another step to guard against potential Soviet aggression. In 1948, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom had signed the Treaty of Brussels, forming a military alliance for purposes of protection against the Soviet Union. In 1949, shortly before the Berlin blockade ended, the United States joined those nations as well as Canada, Portugal, Italy, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, an alliance for military assistance and mutual defense. Should one of the member nations be attacked, the others agreed to come to its aid. The capitalist democratic countries that joined NATO formed a bloc, a group of countries united for a common purpose, that became known as the Western Bloc. The Western Bloc opposed communist expansion in Europe by the countries of the Eastern Bloc, composed of the Soviet Union and its allies. In 1955, when West Germany also joined NATO, the Soviet Union formed a military and political alliance of its own, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or the Warsaw Pact. Its other members were the communist nations of Eastern Europe: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, formerly the Soviet occupation zone. The Soviets regarded the pact as a vital defense against a united Western Europe and resurgent Germany. NATO and the Warsaw Pact represented the nations on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain and hardened the lines that had been drawn between them. Figure 14. 6. The Western and Eastern blocs soon faced off against one another, not only in Europe but in the rest of the world as well. The legend explains the color coding of the map and indicates the following information. The Soviet Union USSR is highlighted red. USSR-aligned nations, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, are highlighted pink. The former USSR-aligned country, Albania, aligned until 1960, is highlighted orange. The non-aligned country, Yugoslavia, is highlighted green. The neutral countries, Finland, Switzerland, are highlighted gray. The neutral countries, Western-aligned Austria, Ireland, Sweden, are highlighted purple. The Western-aligned countries, Greece, Norway, Iceland, United Kingdom, France, Denmark, West Germany, Italy, Turkey, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, are highlighted blue. Figure 14. 6. The Cold War in Europe. After West Germany joined NATO in 1955, the Soviet Union and other nations formed their own alliance, resulting in the creation of the Eastern Bloc. Yugoslavia, although a communist nation and considered part of this bloc, had officially divorced itself from Soviet control prior to the Warsaw Pact. Credit: Modification of work, Allegiance of European Countries During the Cold War, by user Goldstagen, /Wikimedia Commons. Public domain link to learning access the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project to find additional information about many different aspects of the Cold War. Cold War strategies. The Cold War between West and East was fought on many fronts with many strategies. Both sides provided aid and technical assistance to countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, many of which had been European colonies until the end of World War II. Through such aid, the United States hoped to contain the spread of communism by depriving countries of an economic reason for aligning themselves with the Soviet Union. Communism was attractive to many poor people. It promised that a nation's wealth would be used to provide for all its citizens, and under the Soviet system, people were provided with jobs, housing, education, health care, and public transportation. although the standard of living was lower than in the West. For poor people who lived with the constant threat of hunger and homelessness and saw no chance of improving their situation, communism was an attractive alternative. Propaganda in the form of literature, visual imagery, and films was also used by each side to shore up support for its policies and political ideology, and to damage the credibility and prestige of the other side. In 1950, the U.S. funded Radio Free Europe began broadcasting news to the countries of the Eastern Bloc, and in 1953, Radio Liberty began broadcasting to the Soviet Union. Radio Free Europe and the Free Europe Committee, an organization of American business executives and lawyers established by the U.S. government, printed leaflets and posters touting the superiority of life in democratic, capitalist countries, and dropped them from weather balloons over East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Soviet propaganda stressed the USSR's desire for world peace and praised the communist ideals of a classless society in which people were treated equally regardless of race or gender. This message had a strong appeal for people in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Some African Americans, confronted by racism and segregation in the United States, were also attracted by these promises. Indeed, opponents of the civil rights movement in the United States often denounced it as communist in nature. Sometimes propaganda took the form of athletic competitions in which each side used its swimmers, runners, weightlifters, and gymnasts to display the superiority of its system. Sports and news broadcasts kept a close watch on the number of medals won by U.S. and Soviet athletes during Olympic competitions. At other times, cultural exchanges took place. Soviet ballet dancers toured the United States, while American jazz musicians and symphony orchestras visited Eastern Bloc countries. Beyond the book Cold War propaganda, both the United States and the Soviet Union used propaganda to convince their own citizens, as well as those of the other country, that their way of life was superior. U.S. propaganda touted the benefits of capitalism and democracy and warned of the lack of freedom under communism. The Soviet Union boasted of the productivity of its citizens and ridiculed the softness of capitalists. Soviet propaganda also routinely invoked the lack of freedom for people of color in the United States. Following are two propaganda cartoons. The first is an American video called Make Mine Freedom that was made in 1948. In it, viewers are warned about the dangers of ism, which listeners in the United States would understand to mean communism. Please note that the video contains racist imagery, as did many American cartoons from this time period. The salesman peddling communism to gullible Americans is wearing a zoot suit, a style of dress associated with men of color. The second video is a Soviet cartoon called The Millionaire that portrays the behavior of the wealthy in the United States. As you watch the videos, look for the claims each side makes about the other. How does the American cartoon depict the United States? How does the Soviet cartoon depict the United States? To what extent is what the United States says about itself true? To what extent is the Soviet depiction of American life accurate? Both sides highlighted their ingenuity and technological achievements. At a 1959 exhibition in Moscow, U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon proudly showed off American technology to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in the form of a model kitchen. Khrushchev's response to the labor-saving gadgetry on display was to inquire whether American families also had machines to save them the effort of putting food in their mouths and swallowing it. The two countries competed to dominate space as well. In 1957, the United States suffered a serious blow to its pride when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite, Figure 14. 7. In response, in 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower called on Congress to establish an agency to explore space. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, was established that year. In 1961, the Soviet Union sent the first astronaut into space. In 1969, the United States put the first humans on the surface of the moon. Part A is a drawing that shows a top portion of the Earth in the bottom right of the drawing. An orb with 4 projections coming off of it, one in each direction, is shown in the middle of the drawing floating in space above the Earth. Part B is a stamp that includes a dog. The stamp reads Posta RP Ramana and Kaika Primal Calator in Cosmos. Figure 14. 7. The Space Race. The Soviet Union's 1957 launching of the satellite Sputnik, shown here in an artist's rendering, spurred the United States to create NASA, its own space agency. The following month, the Soviets topped their achievement by sending a dog, Laika, into space aboard Sputnik 2B, commemorated in this 1959 Romanian stamp. Credit A. Modification of work, first report of Sputnik, by Universal Newsreel/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B. Modification of work, Laika, dog launched into space on stamp from Romania Posta Romania, 1957, by unknown/Wikimedia Commons. Public domain link to learning the late 1950s and 1960s witnessed the efforts of the United States and the Soviet Union to outdo one another in the area of space exploration. Visit the online exhibition dedicated to the history of the space race at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Espionage was another important tool carried out by the United States through the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, formed in 1947, and by the USSR with its spy agency, the KGB. Besides surveilling the other nation, these agencies also plotted, assisted in, and carried out acts of sabotage and the assassination of those deemed enemies of their country. Both the CIA and the KGB fomented discontent in foreign nations as well, trained fighting forces, and encouraged revolution and insurgency to topple foreign governments and install leaders who would be friendly to their respective countries. The CIA, for example, trained Cuban insurgents with the goal of overthrowing the Caribbean islands' communist government under Fidel Castro in 1961. Similarly, the KGB gave assistance to Vietnamese communists attempting to defeat the government of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The most dangerous venue for competition, however, and the two sides' chief means of reining in aggression on the part of the other, was the stockpiling of massive nuclear arsenals. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb, ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons. In 1952, the United States took the next step, one opposed by some of the same atomic scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project during World War II and developed the hydrogen bomb, testing it on the Pacific atoll of Eniwetok in 1952. This missile was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. U.S. development of such a weapon meant the Soviet Union needed to do the same. In the 1950s, both the United States and the USSR developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, as well. Now missiles armed with nuclear warheads could be launched from within the home country's own territory or within the borders of satellite nations. An air force capable of intercepting bomb-bearing planes was no longer sufficient to protect against nuclear attack. Although countries in both the Western and Eastern blocs prepared for potential war by creating shelters to protect citizens in the event of nuclear war, neither side put great faith in its ability to emerge victorious. Both the United States and the USSR quickly came to believe that the key to survival lay in building an immense retaliatory capacity, the ability to unleash devastation so great that the other side would never detonate the first bomb for fear of its own annihilation. In the United States, this defense policy came to be referred to as mutually assured destruction, MAD. Should these nuclear stockpiles prove unsuccessful at deterring a conflict, the large military forces the rivals built up during the Cold War, along with billions of dollars worth of battleships, submarines, and fighter jets, ensured they possessed the capacity to fight a conventional war as well. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how China became a communist nation in 1949. Describe how the Korean War began. Explain why the United States took part in the wars in Indochina. Discuss the Great Leap Forward and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. In the immediate post-war period, Europe was the focus of U.S. anti-communist anxiety. The United States expended billions of dollars in Marshall Plan aid to stave off the expansion of communism there. It was in Asia, however, that the policy of containment was most strongly challenged. Chinese Revolution. Since the 1920s, two groups had contested for control of China: the Guomindang GMD, or Nationalist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. During World War II, the GMD, led by Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, had attempted to fight the Japanese from their wartime capital in Chongqing, while the CCP led by Mao Zedong had watched from their base in Yan'an, a town in northern Shanxi province. With the exception of a brief period of truce between the two parties, the CCP and the GMD fought with one another as well. After the surrender of Japan, the United States had attempted to broker a peace between the Guomindang and the CCP that it hoped would lead to a stable, unified China. Early efforts were successful, and an agreement was reached to create a constitutional government in China with parliamentary rule. Attempts by Chiang to enlarge the role of the GMD led the agreement to collapse, however, and both sides resumed battle. The Soviet Union covertly provided support for Mao and the CCP, and the United States assisted Chiang and the Nationalists. At first, the GMD seemed certain to win. Its forces greatly outnumbered the CCP's, and it also had more money and controlled China's major cities. By 1947, however, the tide had begun to turn. Despite its seeming advantages, the GMD was unpopular among much of the population. One reason was that after the war, the factories, homes, and businesses the Japanese had seized from Chinese owners came under the Nationalists' control and remained there, alienating the urban middle class that had once supported them. In addition, the Nationalists refused to reopen many of these factories and businesses, worsening the post-war unemployment problem and driving urban workers, who already favored the Communists, even further into the arms of the CCP. Ruinous hyperinflation, which the GMD was unable to control, added to the strains of urban life. Enlisted members of the Nationalist Army were often underfed and scorned by their officers, and many ran away or defected to the CCP. In the countryside, too, Chiang's forces received little help from peasants, who remembered the onerous taxes the GMD had imposed on them during World War II. In contrast, CCP forces had been winning over the ordinary Chinese person. They pursued a vigorous policy of land reform, lowering rents and taxes and encouraging landless peasants in the areas they controlled to deprive landlords and wealthy peasants of their property. In areas where most peasants already owned land and rents were low, the CCP helped create stability by pursuing the bandits who preyed on them. Furthermore, CCP forces were disciplined and were instructed not to abuse people. Even Chinese people who did not support them could not help but notice that they were better managers than the Nationalists. In 1949, the CCP's People's Liberation Army decisively defeated the forces of the GMD, who retreated to the island of Taiwan. On October 1, 1949, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, PRC, in a ceremony in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, Figure 14. 8. The United States refused to recognize the CCP's government as legitimate and maintained that nationalist-led Taiwan was the real China. Mao was undeterred. He pledged industrial development, universal education, equality between the sexes, land reforms for peasants, and civil liberties for all, including freedom of expression. Mao and the CCP moved quickly to enact their promises, beginning immediately on the task of giving peasants ownership of the land they worked. A photograph shows men standing behind several standing microphones. The men are of Asian descent, wearing suits. Some have glasses on. They are standing listening to one man in the middle of the picture read from a white piece of paper into the microphones. Figure 14. 8. The birth of the People's Republic of China. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. October 1 is celebrated as National Day every year and begins a week-long holiday in China. Credit: Chairman Mao proclaiming the founding of the PRC by PD China Internet Information Center /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Among the people most affected by the establishment of the PRC were the inhabitants of Tibet. Tibet had been claimed as Chinese territory by the Qing as well as earlier dynasties, but it had gained its independence with the fall of the Qing and the establishment of the Republic of China in January 1912. In 1949, the government of Tibet informed Mao that it had no intention of being made part of China again. Its attempts to negotiate independence failed, however, and in October 1950 the PRC invaded, swiftly overwhelming Tibet's small, poorly trained army. In 1951, representatives of the PRC and the Tibetan government signed the 17-point agreement, making the region once again part of China, an event described by the CCP as the liberation of Tibet. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, the ruler of Tibet and leader of Tibetan Buddhism, fled to India with other members of the Tibetan government, who maintained that the agreement with China had been made under duress. In 1965, Tibet became an autonomous region of China, which gave it a greater degree of self-government. Along with making changes in China's domestic policy, Mao also plotted a new course for China in foreign policy. In February 1950, the PRC and the Soviet Union signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. Under its terms, they were to combat any renewed Japanese aggression, work to advance their mutual interests, and refrain from entering into any alliances that were hostile to the other party. All this was part of China's new, lean to one side foreign policy position, in which the country would favor socialist nations and assist those seeking to free themselves from control by imperialist powers. China soon found its new commitments tested by the need to support a fellow communist nation and counter a threat to its own borders in Korea. The two Koreas. On August 15, 1945, the nation of Korea, which had been occupied by Japan during World War II and had been a Japanese colony for many years before that, was divided in half at the 38th parallel of latitude. The United States assumed responsibility for disarming the southern part of the Korean peninsula, and the Soviet Union took on the task of disarming the northern half. At the Moscow Conference held in December 1945, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union agreed that they and China would jointly govern Korea for a period of 5 years, after which it would be reunified and given its independence. The Korean people's opposition to the division of their nation and its subjection to foreign rule was ignored. Not long after the Moscow Conference, talks between the United States and the Soviet Union on how best to reunify Korea broke down. The two sides were too far apart ideologically, so in 1947, the United States handed the problem of Korean reunification over to the United Nations, UN. The UN General Assembly called for elections to be held in Korea, and a temporary commission on Korea was formed. In the years since the original division of the nation, however, North Korea's Communist Party, supported by the Soviet Union, had grown in power and now proved unwilling to relinquish it. North Korea therefore refused to participate in the election. Given this opposition, in May 1948, elections to a constitutional assembly were held only in South Korea. A constitution was drafted, and the authoritarian anti-communist Syngman Rhee was elected president in July. In August, Rhee proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Korea, ROK. 10 days later, elections were held in North Korea, and a separate government for the new Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established with Communist Kim Il-sung as its leader. With the country now seemingly permanently divided and troops wanted elsewhere, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Korea, and the United States moved most of its troops out as well. Without the forces of the two superpowers, which had each wished to avoid provoking the other, border clashes occurred between North and South Korean troops from 1948 to 1950. North Korean forces hoped to encourage uprisings by communists in the South, and South Korean forces fought to keep Northern troops out to prevent the overthrow of the South's government. On June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army KPA of North Korea invaded South Korea, confident of welcome. The ROK troops were unable to halt their advance, and within 2 days Seoul, the capital of South Korea, had fallen. The United States was taken by surprise. South Korea was not considered of vital importance to U.S. security. However, Japan was, and President Truman, in keeping with the domino theory, believed a stable non-communist Korea was necessary to protect Japan. Unwilling to see another Asian country fall to communism, he also feared U.S. reluctance to respond would send a signal to the Soviet Union that it was free to act aggressively in Europe, the area of greatest U.S. interest. Accordingly, Truman approached the United Nations asking for a condemnation of North Korea's actions and requesting the assistance of member nations in South Korea's defense. The UN Security Council responded quickly. It condemned North Korea's invasion of South Korea, and after a brief debate, on June 27, it issued Resolution 83, calling on the UN's members to resist North Korean aggression. The Security Council's actions could have been prevented by a veto of its 5 permanent members: China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. However, since the nationalists' loss in the Chinese Civil War, the United States had insisted that China's seat on the council belonged to Taiwan, not to the People's Republic of China, and the Soviet Union had boycotted the council's meetings in protest. It was thus unable to stop the resolution from passing. The United States suspected the invasion of South Korea had been a ploy by the Soviets to test the U.S. response to an act of armed communist aggression. But Stalin had in fact warned Kim against it. Unwilling to start a war with the United States in Asia, he advised Kim to seek assistance not from Moscow, but from Mao, whose CCP forces North Korea had aided in the Chinese Civil War. Thus, while the United States immediately dispatched air and naval forces to Korea, the Soviet Union sent nothing. Initially, Kim did not need assistance, though, and North Korean troops swiftly overran nearly the entire Korean peninsula, with ROK, UN, and U.S. forces clinging to the area around the port of Pusan in the south, figure 14. 9. 2 maps of Korea are shown. Both maps show the same region that includes a southeastern section of China, the Yalu River, North Korea, and South Korea. On both maps, the Yalu River is the border between China and Korea. Map A is labeled 5/1950 and shows Korea divided horizontally in half into North Korea, highlighted red, and South Korea, highlighted green. Map B is labeled 9/1950. The entire map is red except a small portion on the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula, which is green. Figure 14. 9. The Korean War begins. A. The map on the left shows the division of the Korean peninsula between North and South in May 1950, the month before the Korean War began. B. By September, the North Korean army had forced South Korean, UN, and U.S. troops to retreat to the far southeastern part of the peninsula. Credit: a modification of work, Map of Korean War in May 1950, by Wikimedia/Wikimedia Commons, CC010. Credit B. Modification of work, Map of Korean War in September 1950, by Wikimedia/Wikimedia Commons, CC010. The situation was reversed in September 1950, when U.S. troops led by General Douglas MacArthur landed behind KPA lines at Incheon. Seoul was swiftly retaken and returned to power. With his original objective met, MacArthur was given a new goal: to reunify Korea under Rhee's control if possible, and if the attempt did not lead to Chinese or Soviet intervention. Despite a warning by China that its forces would enter the war should the 38th parallel be crossed, MacArthur's forces, with permission from the UN, did just that, chasing KPA troops northward toward the Yalu River, North Korea's border with China. Although not all prominent members of the Chinese Communist Party approved of committing troops to a war in Korea, Mao favored sending aid to Kim. Chinese forces had been gathering with the intention of invading Taiwan and defeating the nationalist government there. But when the United States moved its 7th Fleet into the straits between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland, China's opportunity was lost. Its forces that might otherwise have gone to Taiwan now entered the fray in Korea, crossing the Yalu River on October 19, 1950. By December, Chinese and North Korean forces had sent UN and U.S. troops into retreat back across the 38th parallel into South Korea. A ceasefire proposed by the UN was rejected by the Chinese forces, and fighting raged through the harsh Korean winter. By July 1951, the war had turned into a deadly stalemate near where it began, along the 38th parallel. Both sides, exhausted, began to discuss peace on July 10. Negotiations dragged on for 2 years as the two sides fought to gain as much territory as possible before a ceasefire was finally proclaimed. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. To prevent the recurrence of hostilities, a Korean demilitarized zone was established, roughly along the 38th parallel, to be patrolled by North and South Korean forces, and U.S. troops remained in South Korea as a deterrent to future North Korean aggression. Like many of the proxy wars of the Cold War, in which the troops of nations allied with the United States and the Soviet Union faced off against one another rather than risk direct conflict between the superpowers, the Korean War was futile. Approximately 3 million people died in the 3-year conflict, most of them Korean civilians who either were caught in the crossfire or became victims of starvation and disease, and all Korea's cities lay in ruins. No territory was gained by either side, and no political transformation occurred in either the North or the South. The country remained divided, with North Korea adopting an isolationist policy that left it cut off from the West. China also suffered as a result of the Korean War. Now regarded by the United States and Western Europe as an aggressor nation, it too found itself isolated and dependent on the Soviet Union for assistance. In the United States, the outbreak of the war had pushed President Truman to adopt the policy recommended by the State Department in NSC 68, a document that, among other things, called for increased spending on defense. Although Truman had initially been reluctant to do so, the need to confront the Chinese forces on the Korean peninsula led him to more than triple U.S. defense spending. Korea had convinced the country of the need to always possess the capability to do battle with communist forces. China's actions in Korea also bolstered U.S. resolve both to protect the nationalist government in Taiwan and to act decisively to stop the spread of communism in Asia. In 1954, the United States joined Britain, France, Thailand, Pakistan, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand to form the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEAT, to prevent the expansion of communism in Southeast Asia. The organization had no capacity to mobilize troops, however, and focused largely on trying to improve standards of living in the region, in the hope of making communism less attractive. Alarmed by the creation of SEATO, in September 1958, the PRC began to bombard Jinmen, Quem, Mazu Matsu, and Dashin, islands off the coast of China that Taiwan claimed as territory belonging to the nationalists, in what was called the First Taiwan Strait Crisis. Although the United States had no wish to engage in war with the PRC, the attacks on the islands led it to sign a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, assuring the nation of U.S. support in the event of war with China. In 1958, the PRC once again bombarded Jinmen and Mazu, sparking the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis. When the United States began to supply the nationalist troops stationed on the islands, the bombardment ended. The situation was not fully resolved until the 1970s, when the United States and the PRC had established more peaceful relations with one another. Southeast Asia. The lessons of Korea also strengthened the U.S. commitment to oppose the spread of communism in Vietnam. Following the end of World War II, France wished to reclaim control of Vietnam, which had been its colony before being seized by Japan in 1940. However, the Vietnamese nationalist group the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, wished to seize the opportunity of Japan's surrender to proclaim their country's independence. The Viet Minh had fought the Japanese during World War II and had often assisted the U.S. military. Ho Chi Minh fully expected that the United States would support them. In their own words, Ho Chi Minh proclaims independence. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnam's freedom from French rule. In his speech, excerpts of which follow, he stated a long list of grievances of the Vietnamese people against the French colonialists and argued that the Vietnamese people should be free to rule themselves. In the autumn of 1940, when the Japanese fascists violated Indochina's territory to establish new bases in their fight against the Allies, the French imperialists went down on their bended knees and handed over our country to them. Thus, from that date, our people were subjected to the double yoke of the French and the Japanese. Their sufferings and miseries increased. The result was that, from the end of last year to the beginning of this year, from QU Letter 1EA3, NGTR Letter 1ECB province to northern Vietnam, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died from starvation. On March 9, 1945, the French troops were disarmed by the Japanese. The French colonialists either fled or surrendered, showing that not only were they incapable of protecting us, but that, in the span of 5 years, they had twice sold our country to the Japanese. For these reasons, we, the members of the Provisional Government, representing the whole Vietnamese people, declare that from now on we break off all relations of a colonial character with France. We repeal all the international obligation that France has so far subscribed to on behalf of Vietnam, and we abolish all the special rights the French have unlawfully acquired in our fatherland. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer the country. We are convinced that the Allied nations, which at Tehran and San Francisco have acknowledged the principles of self-determination and equality of nations, will not refuse to acknowledge the independence of Vietnam, a people who have courageously opposed French domination for more than 80 years, a people who have fought side by side with the Allies against the fascists during these last years. Such a people must be free and independent. Ho Chi Minh, Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. What arguments does Ho Chi Minh make for Vietnam being an independent country? Why does he believe the Allies will support him? Members of the U.S. military who had worked with Ho liked and respected him. However, while he was primarily a nationalist and no one questioned his patriotism, he was also a communist. Wanting to stand firm against what it saw as Soviet-directed communist expansion, the United States also wished to support its ally France, whose help it believed it needed to prevent the spread of communism in Europe. Thus, as the First Indochina War raged between French troops and the supporters of Ho Chi Minh, the United States assumed most of France's financial burden for the war. China and the Soviet Union gave assistance to Ho's forces. Following its defeat in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France granted independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. According to the Geneva Accords, the peace treaty ending the war, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel of latitude with the assumption that, following national elections in 1956, it would be reunified, figure 14. 10. Ho Chi Minh governed the North and was expected to be the popular candidate in both North and South. The South was governed by a figurehead, the Emperor Bao Dai, and his prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem, a strong anti-communist, came from a family of wealthy Roman Catholics in a country where most people were poor and Buddhist. Before the elections, approximately 1 million Vietnamese Catholics from the North moved to the South, fleeing communist rule and bolstering support for Diem, who was backed by the United States. But he remained unpopular with the majority of Vietnamese people. The map of Southeast Asia shows China, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam. Laos is highlighted green, Cambodia is highlighted purple, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, is highlighted blue, the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, is highlighted orange. Figure 14. 10. The Geneva Accords. As a result of the 1954 Geneva Accords, the French colony of Indochina was divided into separate nations. Laos, Cambodia, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. North and South Vietnam were to be reunified following national elections. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Ngo Dinh Diem had no intention of relinquishing power, however. He argued that South Vietnam had not signed the Geneva Accords and so was not bound by them. The United States, as a SEATO member and knowing that Ho Chi Minh would easily win the majority of the vote in both North and South, supported Diem's position. In 1955, well before any elections could take place, a referendum was held in South Vietnam instead. The rigged results revealed that Diem was favored by more than 98% of voters, and he proclaimed himself president. In reality, he was a ruthless politician who allowed no opposition and used the military to attack South Vietnamese Buddhists and students who protested his rule. Influenced by his brother Ngo Dinh Thuc, the Archbishop of the city of Hue, Diem forbade the flying of the Buddhist flag. His regime also redistributed land taken from Buddhist peasants to Catholic ones and dispensed more aid to Catholics. In 1963, Buddhist monks in South Vietnam engaged in several acts of self-immolation, setting themselves on fire in public places to draw attention to the abuses of Diem's brutal and corrupt regime. When foreign journalists questioned why the monks felt the need to engage in such dramatic protest, Diem's sister-in-law and South Vietnam's unofficial First Lady, Madame Nhu, compared the suicides to barbecues. The Second Indochina War, sometimes simply called the Vietnam War, began in 1959 when the North Vietnamese Communist Party, seeking to unify the country under communist rule, called for a people's war against the government of South Vietnam. North Vietnam received support from both China and the Soviet Union. Also helping the North was a group of South Vietnamese communists, many of whom had relocated to North Vietnam following the Geneva Accords. These men and women officially formed the National Liberation Front, NLF, in North Vietnam in 1960. Popularly known as the Viet Cong, the NLF returned to the South to organize peasants and begin an insurgency against the government of South Vietnam and the United States. U.S. President John F. Kennedy responded by continuing to do what his predecessors had done. He sent money and advisors to the South Vietnamese government, but refused to commit ground troops. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong wanted China to chart the direction that communism took in Asia, just as the Soviet Union determined its direction in Europe. To do so, however, China needed to be much more powerful than it was in 1949, when the CCP declared the foundation of the People's Republic and the nationalists fled. In imitation of the Soviet model, Mao instituted a 5-year plan in China in 1953 and embarked on nearly 700 industrial projects, more than 100 with the assistance of the Soviet Union. He also began the collectivization of agriculture by forcing peasants to labor together on state-owned farms instead of tending to farms worked by individual families. The plan was largely successful in terms of industrial development, and China's steelmaking, coal mining, and machine and cement producing capacity all increased. Although the first 5-year plan was successful, the second 5-year plan proved a disaster. This plan, also known as the Great Leap Forward, began in 1958. Mao, inspired by the Soviet Union's plans to overtake the United States in industrial capacity, proclaimed that China would surpass the United Kingdom. To that end, agricultural production was to increase at the same time as industrial production, and the proceeds of agriculture would fund industry. Collectivization efforts were intensified, and by the end of 1958, more than 25,000 communes had been created, each consisting of several thousand families on average. Communes were large units of production. Members worked together to grow crops in warm months and build construction projects during the winter. Food was prepared in communal kitchens, and everyone ate together in communal dining halls. Communes also operated schools and hospitals for their members. All tools, livestock, food, and other valuable items belonged to the commune as a whole instead of to individuals or families, and the commune's leaders determined what work each member would do. Grain produced by communes in the countryside fed city dwellers and industrial workers. Encouraged to grow ever more, communes began to exaggerate their grain production levels to win political favor. Even as they strove to grow more food, laborers were also ordered to engage in extra projects like dam construction. Farm laborers were also ordered to produce steel in backyard furnaces hastily built in the countryside, figure 14. 11. Some were assigned to steel production exclusively, but others who worked in the fields by day were often forced to tend the furnaces at night. To meet quotas, they stripped the countryside of wood and burned their own furniture to fuel the furnaces. In the end, the steel produced was of such low quality that it was worthless. A photograph of a large field is shown with houses and hills in the background. In the foreground, workers move about the field dressed in long shirts, pants, and large hats. There are many circular steel containers arranged in 3 rows in the field, some with square holes in them, some covered with pieces of cloth. Figure 14. 11. The Great Leap Forward. During the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s, Chinese peasants were encouraged to build small furnaces to produce steel that often proved worthless. Credit: Modification of work, backyard furnace to produce steel during the Great Leap Forward era, by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The requisitioning of grain to feed the cities, combined with bad weather, and the use of farm labor for industrial projects, to produce disaster in rural China. In some areas, floods and locust swarms destroyed crops. In others, too much of the harvest was diverted to the cities to leave enough for the peasants to eat. Famine set in, and people ate bark, leaves, and clay. Some Chinese historians place the death toll at 5 million, while Western historians believe 30 to 50 million people died between 1959 and 1961. The stupendous failure of the Great Leap Forward stunned Mao. He turned to other members of the CCP, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, and Liu Shaoqi, to rectify the situation and allowed them to largely assume day-to-day control of China. Deng especially began to reverse some of Mao's more damaging policies by, for example, allowing peasants to sell grain surpluses. Given positive incentives to produce more food, the peasants did so, alleviating food shortages. Mao was sensitive to failure, however, and resented the successes of Zhou, Deng, and Liu. When Marshal Peng Dehuai, the Minister of Defense and a longtime associate of Mao, criticized his handling of the Great Leap Forward, Mao dismissed him from his position and replaced him with Lin Biao. In 1966, Mao abruptly warned that revisionists were seeking to alter the direction of the CCP. He called on the younger generation of Chinese people, high school and university students and young factory workers, to engage in class struggle and save the revolution. In July 1966, he launched the event known as the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Students organized themselves into groups of Red Guards, guided by quotations of Mao that Lin Biao had gathered and published in a Little Red Book. In August 1966, millions of Red Guards rallied in Beijing as Mao and Lin Biao encouraged them to purge the country of bourgeois elements by attacking the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Red Guards then attacked and killed their teachers and school administrators. At one school, students beat the gardener to death because he tended the lawn, a bourgeois concern. Provided with food and lodging at government expense, Red Guards rampaged through the country, destroying books, works of art, temples, monasteries, tombs, and historical sites. They beat people and forced them to confess to having bourgeois thoughts. No one knows how many were killed during the Cultural Revolution. It may have been as many as 2 million. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, who displayed insufficient revolutionary fervor, were removed from positions of power. In 1968, the Red Guards were themselves dismissed as Mao sought to curb their power. They were sent to the countryside along with other urban youth to learn from the peasants. In 1969, Lin Biao was named Mao's successor. 2 years later, Lin died in a plane crash while attempting to flee to the Soviet Union. He may have feared that Mao suspected him of plotting against him and planned to punish him. Link to learning. The government of the People's Republic of China made extensive use of propaganda to encourage public support. This website has a large collection of Chinese propaganda posters. If you select Go to the Overview on the main page, you will find them arranged chronologically as well as by theme. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the relationship between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, discuss the goals of the non-aligned movement, explain how Indonesia, India, and Egypt attempted to avoid joining either the Western or the Eastern Bloc, identify the causes of the Israeli-Arab conflict in the Middle East. As the Soviet Union and the United States struggled for supremacy, they sought to attract the support of the world's nations by offering financial aid, military support, and technical advice. Many countries were willing to align with one side or the other for a variety of reasons, sometimes ideological but often not. Some nations, however, resisted being drawn into either camp. Yugoslavia. In the aftermath of World War II, the nations of Europe speedily aligned themselves with either the Western or the Eastern Bloc, with one exception: Yugoslavia. In 1942, communist partisans who had fought the Axis powers on behalf of the People's Liberation Front formed a government. the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, AVNOJ. When Italian forces evacuated Yugoslavia in 1943, AVNOJ assumed control of the territory and established the state of Democratic Federal Yugoslavia. The partisans' leader, Josip Broz Tito, was named prime minister. In 1945, Yugoslavia's monarchy was abolished, and Tito was recognized as the leader of the country. This result was confirmed by a nationwide election held shortly thereafter. Yugoslavia was a communist state from the beginning and was one of the founders of the Cominform, the Information Bureau of the Communist and Workers' Parties, in 1947. Cominform's purpose was to give direction to the communist governments of Europe after World War II so that they might coordinate their efforts to oppose anti-communist activity in the rest of Europe. The Soviet Union would be at the fore, providing guidance for the others. Tito and Stalin clashed early on, however. Tito wished to incorporate within Yugoslavia the countries of Bulgaria and Albania, as well as parts of Greece, Italy, and Austria. Stalin opposed Yugoslavia's claims, believing them to be unreasonable and likely to cause trouble with Western Europe. Yugoslavia also aided the Greek communists in their civil war, which Stalin opposed as well, again believing the West would be angered by it. Tito, for his part, refused to accept a secondary position for Yugoslavia. Unlike the other members of the Eastern Bloc, Yugoslavia had liberated itself from the Axis without Soviet assistance. Thus, Tito believed it should be treated by the Soviet Union as an equal, not as a satellite state to which it gave orders. In 1948, Cominform expelled Yugoslavia. For assistance, Tito turned to the United States, which helped Yugoslavia survive despite its inability to trade with its Eastern Bloc neighbors. Tito, however, was equally concerned about becoming a puppet of the United States, and during the 1950s and 1960s, Yugoslavia became economically self-sufficient and traded with members of both the Western and Eastern blocs. In 1960, Tito spoke before the General Assembly of the United Nations and called upon non-bloc countries to unite to achieve common goals of decolonization, disarmament, bans on nuclear testing, and equality of economic development. The Bandung Conference and Indonesia. Among European nations, Yugoslavia's refusal to become a member of either the Western or the Eastern Bloc made it an exception, but a desire to plot a middle path between the superpowers was common in former colonies or protectorates of European powers, especially in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. In April 1955, representatives from 29 such countries in Asia and Africa gathered at a conference in Bandung, Indonesia. Their goal was to be able to rely on one another as they strove to industrialize and avoid the need to turn to Europe, the United States, or the Soviet Union for assistance. This aim formed the basis for the non-aligned movement, an attempt by newly independent nations to stay out of the orbit of either the Western or the Eastern Bloc. Indonesia assumed a leading role in the non-aligned movement. An anti-Dutch independence campaign had developed there before World War II, and in August 1945, two of its leaders, Mohammed Hatta and Kusno Sasardiharjo, known as Sukarno, proclaimed independence for Indonesia, a status that became official in 1949. Sukarno, on becoming president, stressed that the nation wished to remain neutral in foreign affairs. Both the United States and the Soviet Union desired Indonesia as an ally. It was a country with a large population, oil deposits, and a strategically advantageous geographical position. Both sides believed Indonesia's future path, communist or democratic, would greatly influence the other nations of Asia. Accordingly, both courted Sukarno, and Sukarno accepted aid from both. In his eyes, so long as he did not allow either superpower to determine Indonesia's affairs, his country was neutral. In 1956, Sukarno visited China and was impressed by what Mao Zedong had been able to achieve. Believing Mao's ability to centralize power lay at the heart of China's success, upon his return to Indonesia, Sukarno established a national council made up of representatives of larger social groups, such as peasants and workers, to reach decisions by consensus rather than by voting. In the new, guided democracy he established in 1959, the consensus of the nation would be expressed through the president instead of the legislature. To shore up his autocratic authority, Sukarno turned to both the Indonesian Communist Party and the conservative armed forces. His goal was the creation of an Indonesian state based on what he called NASAKOM, an acronym standing for nationalism, religion, and communism. By 1964, Sukarno had abandoned all pretense of neutrality and sought alliances with communist countries while encouraging anti-United States sentiment in Indonesia. In 1965, Suharto, a general in the Indonesian military, claimed that Indonesian communists had sought to subvert the government by plotting to kill Sukarno. Suharto's subsequent destruction of Indonesia's communists, carried out with the aid of the CIA, may have cost the lives of some 1 million people, figure 14. 12. In 1967, Suharto removed Sukarno from office and assumed dictatorial powers. A photograph of the profile of a man in military gear is shown. He is in the front right of the picture and has a cap on, sunglasses, and an emblem on his left shoulder. There is a flat, square platform in front of him and group of people in the background. In the group, a woman dressed in a black dress and sunglasses stands, surrounded by many others. Some of the men are dressed in military gear, with caps, and other women are in black dresses. Figure 14. 12 Suharto. Major General Suharto, right, attends a funeral for generals he claimed were killed in a communist coup. He used the supposed coup as an excuse to kill Indonesian communists. Credit: Suharto at funeral, by Department of Information of the Republic of Indonesia /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. India. Like Indonesia, India sought to plot its own path and remain free of the entangling alliances of the Cold War. And it was also one of the initiators of the non-aligned movement. In 1947, the United Kingdom granted India its independence. Anti-British protests had rocked India throughout 1946, and, exhausted from fighting World War II, Britain could no longer afford to maintain control over its colony. In addition, although the United Kingdom had sufficient troops there, the majority were Indian, and it was uncertain where their loyalties lay. Indeed, in 1946, Indians in the British Navy had mutinied throughout the country. Finally, the United Kingdom's greatest ally and creditor, the United States, pressured the nation to grant India its independence, as the United States had given independence to the Philippines following the war. The announcement that the British would be withdrawing sparked waves of religious violence throughout the nation. Much of it was caused by a dispute over what an independent India would consist of. Hindus in the Indian National Congress called for the maintenance of a single, unified India. Muslims, however, feared that the Hindu majority would dominate the government to their detriment, and many were reluctant to agree to such a situation. A compromise was reached, and at midnight on August 15, 1947, when India achieved its independence, the region of Pakistan, home to a Muslim majority, became an independent nation as well. The past meets the present. Kashmir. In August 1947, when India became independent of the United Kingdom and Pakistan, was established as a separate nation. The status of the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, usually referred to simply as Kashmir, was in question. India wished to retain control of it, but because the state had a largely Muslim population, Pakistan lay claim to it. Thus, India and Pakistan went to war. Peace was established when the United Nations intervened, and Kashmir remained part of India. In 1965, war broke out again when Pakistan tried to seize the Indian state by force. As a result of negotiations mediated by the Soviet Union, both sides withdrew their forces from the region. War erupted a third time in 1971, and fighting broke out yet again in 1999. Between 2016 and 2018, Kashmiri separatists launched a series of attacks on Indian security forces, with India placing the blame on Pakistan as the instigator of the violence. In 2019, following a suicide attack on an Indian army convoy by militants based in Pakistan, the government of India revoked Article 370 of its constitution, which had granted Kashmir a degree of autonomy. In February 2021, a ceasefire agreement was reached between India and Pakistan, and peace returned to the region as local tourists, unable to vacation abroad because of the COVID-19 pandemic, flocked to the mountainous region to enjoy winter sports. How does the Kashmir conflict reflect the politics of the Cold War? How might the continuing tension in the region represent a new kind of Cold War? India's geographic location, bordering both the Soviet Union and China, made it of great interest to the West. The United Kingdom continued to trade with India, supply it with weapons, and train its military officers. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, wished to maintain his distance from the United States, however. He was sympathetic to socialism and had visited the Soviet Union. He recognized the People's Republic of China and opposed the U.S. refusal to allow the PRC to hold China's seat on the UN Security Council. He was also suspicious of U.S. intentions toward India, given the government's treatment of its own citizens of color. Nevertheless, Nehru accepted aid from the United States in the 1950s, just as he did from the Soviet Union. In 1950, India's relationship with China changed when China established border posts in Tibet to demarcate its territory, including land India claimed. India and China sought to maintain an amicable relationship and even signed a treaty affirming the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in 1954. But when Tibet's leader, the 14th Dalai Lama, sought protection in India after fleeing Tibet during an anti-Chinese uprising in 1959, India's support for him angered China. In 1962, a confrontation along the disputed border with Tibet led to war between the two countries. The United States aided India, and while the Soviet Union officially remained neutral, it also continued to provide funds and technology to India. This decision deepened a divide that was already growing between the USSR and China, Egypt and the Middle East. Before World War II, the United States had demonstrated relatively little concern for the Middle East, which fell largely under British control. Following the war, however, problems in the region, some of which stemmed from British policies and actions, threatened to move Arab and Iranian leaders closer to the Soviet Union. This possibility alarmed the United States and led to attempts to forge relationships with Middle Eastern governments. The nations that proved of greatest interest were Iran, Egypt, and the newly formed State of Israel. Iran first became a place of concern to the United States immediately following World War II, when the Soviet Union proved reluctant to end its occupation of the country. Following the war, the United Kingdom had resumed its activities in the region, which largely consisted of drilling for oil. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, an Iranian nationalist, became the country's prime minister and moved to nationalize the oil fields belonging to British companies. This action led to protests by the United Kingdom and by pro-Western Iranian elites who supported British interests. In 1952, Iran's monarch, the pro-Western Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, removed Mossadegh from power. He was forced to reinstate him, however, following massive popular protests. Mossadegh's actions convinced both the United Kingdom and the United States that he favored communism and might ally Iran with the Soviet Union, with which it shared a border. Although it is unlikely he intended to make Iran a satellite state of the Soviet Union, British arguments that this was the case convinced the United States to take action. In August 1953, a coup plotted by the CIA and Iran's military, which supported the Shah, removed Mossadegh from power again. He was arrested and imprisoned. British actions laid the groundwork for another conflict in the Middle East following World War II. In 1917, Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour had declared that Britain would support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Throughout the 1930s, Jewish people from Europe had streamed to the region, and as their numbers increased, so did violence between them and Arabs, who demanded an end to Jewish immigration and the creation of an independent Arab state. Following the end of World War II, as Jewish survivors of the Holocaust sought refuge in Palestine, the British government requested that the United Nations resolve the issue. In 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine visited the region and recommended that it be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state, figure 14. 13. The city of Jerusalem, sacred to both groups, was to be placed under an international trusteeship. In November 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted the committee's suggestion with the passage of Resolution 181. A map of a Palestine is shown. It is labeled Palestine UN Partition Plan, 1947. The legend shows that yellow indicates the Arab state and orange indicates the Jewish state. Egypt is shown on the bottom left of the map, and Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan are labeled north and east of Palestine. A top east portion, a long, thin western portion along the water, and a large portion in the south of Palestine is highlighted orange as Jewish state. A small portion in the north, an oval portion in the center, and an angled portion in the west, along the Egyptian border, are highlighted yellow as Arab state. The cities of Tel Aviv and Jaffa are labeled along the water on the west. Jerusalem, UN admin, is in the middle of the country on a very small white circular portion. The city of Beersheba is in the center of Palestine along an Arab state-Jewish state border. Figure 14. 13 UN Partition Plan for Palestine. The UN's 1947 plan to partition Palestine divided it into Jewish and Arab sectors. Jewish people would control most of the coast and the southern part of the country. The Arab sectors were divided from one another by large areas of Jewish settlement. Credit: UN 1947 Partition Plan for Palestine by U.S. Central Intelligence Agency / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The UN resolution led to civil war in Palestine. The British withdrew from the region in May, leaving Jewish people and Palestinian Arabs, assisted by Arabs from elsewhere in the Middle East who had organized themselves as the Arab Liberation Army, to battle it out. About 250,000 Palestinian Arabs fled Jewish-controlled areas. On May 14, 1948, as the last British forces left the region, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Jewish settlement in Palestine, announced the founding of the nation of Israel, figure 14. 14. A photograph shows several men sitting behind a long table. A man in the middle stands, holds a piece of paper, and speaks into a microphone. In front of the table, groups of men sit in chairs. On the wall behind the table are long drapes, banners with a six-pointed star, and a large portrait of a man in a suit, bow tie, and beard. Figure 14. 14. The founding of Israel. In the city of Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion proclaims the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948. Credit: Declaration of State of Israel 1948 by Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Both the United States and the Soviet Union officially recognized the new state. Israel's Arab neighbors did not, and they proclaimed that Arabs within Israel had a right to self-determination. On the evening of May 14, an air attack on the Israeli city of Tel Aviv began, and the next day forces from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Transjordan, now called Jordan, invaded the country. The First Arab-Israeli War lasted 10 months, with Israel emerging victorious in March 1949. Not only had it defended its existence, but it had also gained control of much of the territory the 1947 UN Committee had recommended reserving for Arab settlement. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs left Palestine, now part of Israel, for neighboring countries. The better-armed Arab nations' loss to Israel came as a shock to many in the Arab world. In Egypt, the Free Officers Movement, a group of mostly junior officers from middle-class backgrounds, criticized their government for its failure. One officer, Gamal Abdel Nasser, blamed the defeat on government corruption and quickly rose to prominence. Like others in the movement, Nasser was a nationalist who wished to end the United Kingdom's influence over its former protectorate of Egypt. On July 23, 1952, he led a group of army officers in a coup that deposed Egypt's luxury-loving King Farouk and assumed control of the nation, figure 14. 15. A photograph shows a crowd, mostly of men. In the middle of the crowd, 7 men are riding in a car looking at the crowd. They wear suits and hats. People from the crowd are reaching out to touch them. Men in military gear and caps walk alongside the car looking down and at the crowd. Figure 14. 15. The Free Officers Movement. Gamal Abdel Nasser, second from the right in the car, rides through the streets of Cairo with other members of the Free Officers Movement following their overthrow of Egypt's king in 1952. Credit: 1953 Egypt Revolution Celebrations by Bibliotheca Alexandrina / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Among Farouk's flaws had been his reliance on an informal cabinet composed largely of non-Egyptians, one of whom had sold defective rifles to the Egyptian military during the war with Israel. Although they were not the reason for Egypt's loss, they became a symbol of the weak, corrupt nature of Farouk's government. The rebellious officers instituted a constitution that made Egypt a secular state and embarked on a program of land reform. Egypt's new leaders also acted to end British influence in their nation. In separate agreements, the United Kingdom agreed to give up its rule in Sudan and evacuate its forces from the Suez Canal zone by 1956, years before required by an existing treaty. As well as weakening British power in the Middle East, Nasser, who became Prime Minister of Egypt in 1954, wished to make his country the leader of the Arab world, a position also sought by Iraq. In 1955, the United Kingdom signed the Baghdad Pact, which created the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, and joined Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan in a military alliance that seemed to thwart both of Nasser's goals. Nasser perceived this as a signal that the West wished to promote Iraq instead of Egypt as the leader of the Arab nations. Seeking to erode both Israeli and Western interests, Nasser sponsored cross-border attacks on Israel by Palestinian Arab guerrilla fighters, refugees from Israel living in Egypt, and gave support to Algerian rebels attempting to throw off French rule. The United States had sought friendly relations with Nasser, partly to prevent him from turning to the Soviet Union and partly to gain supremacy over the United Kingdom in the region. However, when he refused to promise that U.S. weapons would not be used to attack Israel, the United States refused to arm Egypt and, in July 1956, withdrew its promise of aid to build the Aswan Dam across the Nile. Accordingly, Nasser turned to the Eastern Bloc. Czechoslovakia supplied the arms, and the Soviet Union later funded the construction of the dam. On July 26, 1956, Nasser, who had been elected president of Egypt the month before, nationalized the Suez Canal and immediately closed it to Israeli shipping. On October 29, Israel invaded Egypt, and on November 5, Britain and France did as well, touching off the Suez crisis. The United Nations passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire, and both the United States and the Soviet Union demanded an immediate end to the invasion. The Soviet Union threatened to send troops to Egypt and to attack London. U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, anxious not to give the Soviets an excuse to intervene, threatened to impose economic sanctions on France, Israel, and the United Kingdom if they did not comply. All three withdrew, but Israel did so with the guarantee that it would be allowed to use the Straits of Turin to send shipping through the canal. A UN peacekeeping force was left in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula to guard the border with Israel. The Suez Crisis changed the U.S. role in the Middle East. After having had little involvement in the area, the United States now realized that Soviet involvement there was possible. Wishing to prevent this, in 1957, Eisenhower proclaimed the Eisenhower Doctrine, by which the United States would use its military strength to defend Middle Eastern governments in danger of being overthrown by the forces of international communism. The United States also extended financial and military aid to the governments of friendly countries such as Lebanon. The withdrawal of Israel and the Western powers from Egypt augmented Nasser's status as self-proclaimed leader of the Arab world and brought him closer to forging the pan-Arab state he desired. In 1958, he took another step toward that reality when Egypt joined Syria to create the United Arab Republic. The previous year, Turkey, fearing that its neighbor Syria was about to experience a communist takeover, had gathered troops along the Syrian border. When the Soviet Union announced its support for Syria in the event of a Turkish invasion, the U.S. had pledged support for Turkey. Although crisis was averted when Turkey withdrew its troops, Syria proposed a union with Egypt to protect itself from interference by other countries and from the increasing power of the Syrian Communist Party. The two nations separated after a coup in Syria in 1961. In 1958, the United States enforced the Eisenhower Doctrine by sending nearly 15,000 troops to Lebanon at the request of its Christian president, Camille Chamon, to protect his government from political opponents, some of whom were pro-communist. Opposition was led by Lebanon's Sunni Muslim majority, who had supported Lebanon's joining the United Arab Republic when Chamon had refused to do so. U.S. forces remained in Lebanon for 3 months while Chamon finished his term. This diversion of U.S. attention convinced China that it could resume bombing Jinmen and Mazu without risking a response, precipitating the second Taiwan Strait crisis. Although relative peace had returned to the region following the end of the Suez Crisis, also called the Second Arab-Israeli War, Palestinian guerrillas continued to strike at Israel from bases in Egypt and Syria. Often their targets were civilians, and tensions remained high. In April 1967, following air battles between Israeli and Syrian pilots, Egypt, under the false belief that Israel was preparing to invade Syria, removed the UN peacekeeping force from the Sinai Peninsula and amassed troops there. On May 22, Egypt closed the Straits of Turin to Israeli shipping, which Israel considered an act of war. On June 5, Israel began the Third Arab-Israeli War by launching a preemptive strike on Egypt, invading the country by land at the same time that it destroyed virtually the entire Egyptian Air Force. Attempted attacks by Jordan and Syria were fended off, and Israel seized territory from these nations as well as from Egypt. The fighting ended nearly as soon as it had begun, earning the conflict the title of the Six-Day War. Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank of the Jordan River from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, greatly enhancing the size of its territory. The Israeli victory in 1967 did not end the conflict, and air attacks, shelling, and guerrilla fighting between Egypt and Israel continued for several years. Following Nasser's death in 1970, the new president, Anwar Sadat, wished to put a decisive end to the conflict while also reversing the territorial losses suffered by the Arab states in 1967. Although Nasser had moved Egypt more deeply into the Soviet camp over the years, in 1972, Sadat expelled the Soviet advisors. He also began talks with the United States, Israel's chief ally, with the intent of resolving Arab-Israeli hostilities for good. However, Sadat did not want peace to be made until Egypt had regained control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria, which sought the return of the Golan Heights, launched a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish religious calendar, when many Israeli soldiers were off duty. Once again, Israel was victorious. A ceasefire imposed by the United Nations began on October 25. Israel had not lost any of the conquered territory, and in subsequent years, Sadat was forced to engage in more peaceful efforts to seek the return of Egyptian lands. Link to learning. The Arab-Israeli conflict continues today, a complex problem with many different facets. Learn more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the Global Conflict Tracker website. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the reasons for Soviet intervention in Warsaw Pact nations in the 1950s and 1960s. Describe U.S. efforts to contain the spread of communism in Latin America and Asia. Explain the cause of the Sino-Soviet split. Discuss decolonization movements in Africa. The potential for conflict between the United States and the forces of communism was not limited to East Asia, although this part of the world held the greatest risk of strife. And indeed several proxy wars were fought there in the decades following World War II, the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union spread to all parts of the globe. Tensions in Europe. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. He was replaced as leader of the Soviet Union, briefly by Georgy Malenkov and then by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was as ardent an opponent of the Western Bloc as Stalin had ever been, bragging at one meeting that communism would bury capitalism, but he also favored a new attitude toward the United States and a new direction for the Soviet Union. In February 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, Khrushchev denounced the late Stalin and accused him of crimes against the Soviet people. He then embarked on an aggressive process of de-Stalinization, changing Stalin-era policies such as censorship of the arts, releasing many whom Stalin had jailed for political reasons, dissolving the special tribunals that had convicted them, removing Stalin's name from public buildings, and taking monuments to him down. In the Eastern Bloc countries, this signaled the beginning of a political thaw. In June 1956, workers in the Polish city of Poznan rioted to protest food shortages and poor housing along with other grievances. In the autumn, protests began in other cities as well. They had a distinctly nationalistic character and called for such changes as the expulsion of the Soviet army from Poland and the removal of Russian-language classes from Polish schools' curricula. In October, W. Ladislaw Gomulka, who called for governmental reforms, was made the leader of the Polish Communist Party and thus the leader of Poland. Alarmed by the possibility of reforms that might remove Poland from the Eastern Bloc, Khrushchev mobilized Soviet troops in Poland and marched them toward Warsaw even as he flew there in person. After Gomulka assured Khrushchev that he had no intention of ending communism or Poland's relationship with the Soviet Union, Khrushchev agreed that reforms could take place. Accordingly, the collectivization of Polish agriculture was ended, Soviet advisors were sent home, political prisoners were released, and greater freedom was given to the Roman Catholic Church. The success of the Poles inspired others. On October 23, 1956, students marched through the streets of Budapest, Hungary, demanding, among other things, the removal of Stalinist symbols, improvements in wages, economic reforms, and the removal of Soviet troops from the country. The state security police opened fire on students who gathered outside the main radio station to read their demands on the air, and several were killed. An uprising began, with angry citizens fighting both the police and Soviet troops. As protesters attacked the parliament building, Erno Giro, the head of the ruling Hungarian Working People's Party and leader of the country, fled along with his prime minister, András Hegedűs. Imre Nagy, a reformer, took office as prime minister. Unlike Gomulka, Nagy did not wish to institute internal reforms while otherwise remaining loyal to Moscow. On October 28, he called for a ceasefire, dissolved the state security police, and demanded that Soviet troops leave Budapest. On November 1, Nagy announced that Hungary was no longer a member of the Warsaw Pact and would remain neutral in international affairs. 3 days later, Soviet forces entered Hungary to join those the USSR had been on the point of withdrawing until Nagy's announcement. Khrushchev may have feared that Nagy's declaration of Hungarian neutrality threatened the security of the Soviet Union. He may also have wished to demonstrate his resolve to more conservative communists and to the leaders of the other Soviet states. Some argue that the Western Bloc's failure to intervene emboldened him. The uprising came to an end on November 10 after about 2,500 Hungarians had been killed, and the communist government was re-established under János Kadar. Approximately 20,000 Hungarians were arrested and another 200,000 fled the country. Soviet troops were permanently stationed in Hungary, and Nagy was tried and executed in 1958. The United States did not become involved in the events in Hungary, a decision Khrushchev later mocked. However, despite not wishing a confrontation with the Soviets, the United States soon found it could not ignore Khrushchev's ultimatum regarding Berlin. In 1958 and again in 1961, Khrushchev demanded that Britain, France, and the United States leave West Berlin, demands that went unheeded. The capitalist part of the old German capital was a thorn in Khrushchev's side. Not only did its prosperity arouse discontent among the residents of the communist eastern districts, but the openness allowed there enabled many people from East Germany and elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc to escape to freedom. On the evening of August 12-13, 1961, East German troops erected a barbed wire fence to divide the western part of Berlin from the eastern. In the days that followed, cement walls went up as well to stop the free passage from east to west. On October 22, a dispute erupted between the United States and the Soviet Union regarding the free passage of U.S. government employees between East and West Berlin. The United States maintained that, in keeping with agreements reached at Potsdam at the end of World War II, members of the Allies could travel freely throughout Berlin. To test the Soviets' commitment to abide by this agreement, the U.S. began to send cars carrying U.S. officials across the dividing line to see if they would be stopped. If they were, U.S. troops, sometimes riding in tanks, then accompanied them across. On October 27, the USSR responded by sending some of its own tanks to the entrance to East Berlin. U.S. and Soviet tanks aimed their guns at one another. A fight was narrowly averted when Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to remove their tanks at the same time. Link to learning. The Berlin Wall separated the residents of East and West Berlin from 1961 until it was destroyed in 1989. While it stood, it provided a canvas for the people of West Berlin to record their whims and fantasies as well as political messages. This website shows photographs of the Berlin Wall and its art 6 months before it was torn down. Tensions flared in Europe yet again in 1968 when Czechoslovakia, like Poland and Hungary before it, sought to loosen its ties to the Soviet Union. Early in the year, the country's conservative leader Antonin Novotny was replaced by Alexander Dubček. Dubček instituted economic reforms and ended government censorship. As Czechs called for even greater reforms, the Soviet Union became alarmed, as it had in Poland and Hungary in 1956, fearing that changes in Czechoslovakia would stimulate calls for reform elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc or in the Soviet republics themselves. And confident the United States would not intervene, just as it had failed to do before, the new Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev ordered an invasion of Czechoslovakia on August 20, 1968. By early 1969, resistance had largely disappeared, and the Soviet Union replaced Dubček with the conservative Gustav Husak, who reversed Dubček's reforms. Censorship was restored, and government control increased again. For the Soviets, this was a successful application of the Brezhnev Doctrine, the pledge to assist communist governments in danger of being overthrown. Tensions in Latin America. In the 1930s and 1940s, the United States had exercised a good neighbor policy toward other nations of the Western Hemisphere, refraining from intervening in their affairs. The desire to contain communist expansion, however, led Washington to take a much more interventionist approach in Latin America and the Caribbean in the 1950s and 1960s. In 1944, an uprising in Guatemala ousted the military dictator Jorge Ubico, who had held power since 1931. Philosophy professor Juan José Arevalo became the country's first democratically elected president in 1945. He was succeeded in office in 1951 by Jacobo Arbenz, who began a program of land reform in the desperately poor country. Arbenz also legalized the Guatemalan Party of Labor, a communist labor union. In the eyes of the United States, Guatemala seemed to be drifting toward communism, figure 14. 16. This poster shows a person in long pants and a flowy shirt carrying a hoe over a rounded portion of land with a bush in the bottom right. A bird flies above the person. The caption at the top of the poster states, Tierra y Libertad in white block letters, and the caption at the bottom states, Con la Reforma Agraria. Figure 14, 16 Land and Freedom. A 1952 poster promises Guatemalan peasants land and freedom, along with the agrarian reforms promoted by Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz's plans led U.S. officials to fear he would align Guatemala with the Eastern Bloc. Credit: Reforma Agraria de Guatemala by Fotos Antiguas de Guatemala / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. This view of the matter was encouraged by the United Fruit Company, a U.S. company that owned plantations throughout Central America, where it grew bananas for the American market. As the single largest landowner in Guatemala, United Fruit was resistant to any forces that might limit its access to land. Thus, Arbenz's land redistribution plans threatened its interests, and his support for the Guatemalan Party of Labor also promised to undermine the company's control over its employees. United Fruit convinced first the Truman administration and then the Eisenhower administration to remove Arbenz from power. Eisenhower was a strong anti-communist, as were his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the head of the CIA Allen Dulles, John's brother. The Dulles brothers were also closely connected to the United Fruit Company. In 1954, forces led by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas but armed and trained by the CIA removed Arbenz from power. Upon taking office, Arbenz instituted a military dictatorship, outlawed the political opposition, and began to attack the power of the unions. It is unlikely that Arbenz sought to place Guatemala within the Eastern Bloc. Soviet influence was active elsewhere in Latin America, however. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista seized power in Cuba in a military coup. Batista, who was financially supported by the U.S. government, held tight control over the island nation and used secret police to silence his opponents, often by means of torture and murder. He wielded his political power to protect the interests of wealthy Cubans and large landowners, among whom were many U.S. executives who controlled Cuba's sugar industry. Opposition to Batista was led by a young lawyer and activist named Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl. When Fidel Castro failed to remove Batista from power legally by challenging the constitutionality of Batista's seizure of power, he and his brother began to organize members of Cuba's disgruntled working class. The revolution against Batista began on July 26, 1953, with unsuccessful attacks on military bases in Santiago and Bayamo that culminated in the capture of the Castro brothers. Released from prison 2 years later, they retreated to Mexico, where they joined other Cuban exiles and a young Argentine named Ernesto Che Guevara to train and plot their return to Cuba. In 1956, Fidel Castro and his followers returned to Cuba and led the 26th of July movement, named for their first failed attempt to topple Batista's government in attacks on the Cuban government. After 2 years of fighting, Castro's rebels were successful, and on December 31, 1958, Fulgencio Batista fled to the Dominican Republic. On January 2, 1959, the military commander guarding Havana ordered his soldiers to lay down their weapons, and the revolutionaries entered the capital in triumph, figure 14. 17. A photograph shows a man standing inside a building in a white short-sleeved shirt and pants, holding a pistol in his right hand and smiling. Behind him stands a woman in pants holding a rifle while it rests on the floor. Surrounding them in several rows in a semicircle is a large group of men, all holding rifles or other weapons. Above them on a platform with a glass railing are more men with weapons looking down at the group below. Figure 14. 17 Cuban revolutionaries. Cuban revolutionaries occupy the foyer of the Hilton Hotel in Havana, Cuba, shortly after their victory in 1959. Fresh from the fight, they still carry their weapons. Credit: Modification of work, Cuban rebel soldiers in the Habana Hilton foyer, January 1959, by The Guardian/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. At first, the United States recognized Cuba's new government. Fidel Castro was interviewed on the popular American television program, The Ed Sullivan Show, a few days after his forces proved victorious. And Castro himself visited the United States to request aid in developing his country. In an address before the United Nations, he placed Cuba in the non-aligned camp. When asked, he insisted he was not a communist. Despite these protestations, Castro worried the U.S. government. He began a program of land reform and forbade foreign ownership of land. He appointed communists, including Che Guevara, to important government positions. In August 1960, he began to nationalize foreign companies in Cuba, including many owned by U.S. citizens. Many wealthy and middle-class Cubans left the country. A large number relocated to the United States, only about 90 miles away. The United States, now convinced of Castro's communist leanings, imposed economic sanctions on Cuba. If the island were allowed to become communist, Washington feared, communism would spread elsewhere in Latin America. Denied U.S. assistance, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for help. The United States was reluctant to take aggressive action against Cuba for fear of moving Castro closer to the Soviets. However, the CIA trained Cuban exiles in Florida who had formed the Democratic Revolutionary Front. Their goal was to launch an invasion of Cuba that they believed would spark a popular uprising and the overthrow of the Castro government. By assisting the Democratic Revolutionary Front, the United States hoped to achieve the goal of defeating Castro without committing American troops. On the night of April 17, 1961, the long-awaited Bay of Pigs invasion began, named for the spot where the invaders were to come ashore. It ended in disaster. Although they quickly overcame a local militia force, the invaders could not hold out against the Cuban army. Anticipated air support from the United States failed to materialize, and the invaders surrendered 3 days later. The United States was humiliated, and far from weakening Castro, its aggressive actions may actually have increased support for the revolution and strengthened nationalistic fervor among the Cuban people. The failed invasion also led Castro to seek protection from the Soviet Union. Cuba had been of little interest to the Soviets until now, but by protecting it from U.S. threats, the Soviet Union stood to gain increased status in the region while also thwarting its Cold War rival. Indeed, failure to protect Cuba, Khrushchev feared, would send a message to other revolutionaries in Latin America that the Soviets were unable to protect them from U.S. aggression too. Accordingly, in 1962, the Soviet Union armed Cuba with nuclear missiles, and the construction of missile launch facilities on the island began that summer. Photographs taken by a U-2 surveillance plane alerted the U.S. government to the presence of the missiles, aimed at the United States. After convening the National Security Council in October 1962, President Kennedy weighed his options. Although the U.S. military suggested an invasion of Cuba, he feared that would lead the Soviets to attack Berlin in retaliation. He could not allow the Soviet action to go unchallenged, however. To do so would make the United States, and Kennedy personally, seem weak. On October 22, Kennedy ordered the Navy to form a blockade around Cuba to intercept Soviet ships delivering additional missiles. He informed the world of this quarantine, avoiding the word blockade, because under international law, a blockade could be considered an act of war. U.S. forces around the world were placed on high alert, and U.S. planes flew low over Cuba in preparation for a potential invasion, the only option for removing the missiles if the Soviets did not back down. On the island below, Soviet technicians continued the missiles' installation, figure 14. 18. An aerial terrain photograph is shown. Most of the left side of the picture shows trees from above, with areas within the trees labeled erector launcher equipment and B-missile trailers. In the middle of the photograph, there are 4 small shapes labeled equipment. In the middle right of the photo, there are 2 areas with small bundles shown in rows that are labeled tent areas. The bottom right of the photograph has a label with construction. A label in the top right indicates MRBM Field Launch Site, San Cristobal No. 1, October 14, 1962. Figure 14. 18 Soviet missiles in Cuba. A photograph taken by a U.S. U-2 spy plane in 1962 clearly reveals evidence of the means to assemble Soviet missiles in Cuba. Credit: Cuba Missiles Crisis U-2 Foe. By the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The world held its breath. For 10 days, people pondered the possibility of nuclear war as the incident, which came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, dragged on. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev refused to retreat. A number of incidents occurred that might each have begun a nuclear conflict. A U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba to monitor the missile installation was shot down and its pilot killed, but Kennedy refrained from acting. Another U-2 mistakenly flew over the Soviet Union's east coast, causing Soviet fighters to take off to intercept it, which in turn led U.S. fighters to take flight. The U.S. Navy dropped a depth charge on a Soviet submarine. The submarine had been maintaining radio silence and was unaware of the events taking place on the surface. Believing a war had started, 2 of the 3 officers on board wanted to launch a nuclear warhead, but the 3rd officer, whose consent was needed, refused to allow them to do so. Earlier that year, the United States had placed missiles in Turkey. Khrushchev was angered, but now he offered Kennedy a way out of the Cuban stalemate. If the missiles in Turkey were removed, those in Cuba would be too. Kennedy accepted the offer. The dismantling of the Cuban missiles began, and on November 2, 1962, Kennedy informed the world of Soviet compliance. On November 20, the blockade ended. In April 1963, the United States removed its missiles from Turkey, though over the protests of the Turkish government. Following the standoff, A direct telephone hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to enable instant communications between the leaders of the two rival nations. The dangers of nuclear war did not necessarily diminish, however. Thwarted in their attempt to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, the Soviets focused on the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could strike the United States from Europe. The United States also continued to develop its weaponry. In China, Mao Zedong had criticized the Soviets for being insufficiently supportive of socialist revolution around the world. So Khrushchev's willingness to back down when confronted by the United States and to seemingly abandon Cuba gave credence to Mao's claims. It also improved Mao's position within the Chinese Communist Party. He had found himself locked in a struggle with other CCP members, who favored closer relations with the Soviet Union because of the economic and technological expertise it could provide. The humiliation of the Soviets now weakened the position of those members, such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Conversely, Khrushchev's power was seriously damaged by the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 2 years later he was forced from office. Although the United States achieved its goal of removing Soviet missiles from Cuba, Castro's government nevertheless remained in power. Communist parties were also strong in other parts of Latin America. In 1961, Rafael Trujillo, the anti-communist dictator of the Dominican Republic, was assassinated and replaced by the liberal reformer Juan Bosch, who was himself overthrown by the Dominican Army in 1963. On April 24, 1965, liberal Dominican Army officers rose up in revolt in an attempt to return Bosch to power. 4 days later, 22,000 U.S. troops invaded in order to prevent a communist takeover, as President Lyndon Johnson claimed. They placed a conservative government in power. In Chile, Salvador Allende, the candidate of a socialist communist coalition party called Popular Unity, was elected president in 3 consecutive presidential elections in 1958, 1964, and 1970. The CIA worked with the Chilean army to engineer a coup, and in September 1973, Allende and thousands of his supporters were killed. The leader of the coup, General Augusto Pinochet, became Chile's president and ruled as a dictator until 1990. The CIA also trained and funded the right-wing Contras to fight against the Sandinista National Liberation Front, which came to power in Nicaragua after overthrowing the dictatorial President Anastasio Somoza Debayle. The Sandinistas received support from the Soviet Union and Cuba. Tensions in Asia. Though its interventions in Latin America were confounded by Castro's Cuba and popular support for communist parties in other Central and South American countries, the United States continued to try to prevent the spread of communism, notably in Southeast Asia. Escalation in Vietnam. In the summer of 1963, South Vietnamese generals, disgusted by the corruption of Ngo Dinh Diem's regime and realizing his unpopularity was hampering their fight against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, assassinated Diem and his brother Nhu. Though greeted with jubilation by most South Vietnamese, the killings did not lead to the creation of a democratic government. The country was afterward governed by a succession of leaders. None were effective or earned the loyalty of the population. All were maintained in power by the United States, which proved willing to support any politician promising to take a hard line against communism and continue the war against North Vietnam. The U.S. role in the Vietnam War intensified in 1964. In early August, U.S. ships stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, reported they had come under attack. A crew member on duty believed he saw signs of a North Vietnamese torpedo strike on his sonar. Despite the fact that there was no other evidence to support the claim, and the incident most likely did not take place, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964. The resolution gave President Lyndon Johnson permission to retaliate against North Vietnamese attacks and to act first to defend U.S. lives. The situation in Vietnam swiftly escalated. In 1965, Johnson committed U.S. ground forces and began the bombing of the North. Troops from other nations, including Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and South Korea, assisted in the fighting. The guerrilla war fought by the Viet Cong confounded U.S. troops, who came to see every Vietnamese peasant as a potential enemy. They relocated South Vietnamese farmers and burned their villages in an attempt to deny their opponents sources of support. In early 1968, however, a series of coordinated Viet Cong attacks that struck cities and military installations throughout South Vietnam during the Lunar New Year holiday of Tet called into question the success of the U.S. efforts. Although North Vietnamese officials later admitted the Viet Cong had suffered serious losses during the Tet offensive, in the immediate aftermath, it seemed as though the United States and South Vietnam were no closer to defeating North Vietnam than they had ever been. Many in the United States had already begun to question the military's involvement in Vietnam and to call for the withdrawal of troops. Their opposition grew even more intense following the revelation in 1969 that U.S. troops had massacred unarmed peasants in the village of My Lai the year before. By the early 1970s, the United States was seeking a way to escape the situation in Vietnam. President Richard Nixon did not wish to simply withdraw, however. Instead, a peace agreement would have to be reached. North Vietnam had been reluctant to negotiate on U.S. terms, but damage to the relationship between two of its supporters, China and the Soviet Union, had threatened to isolate it and made it more amenable to seeking peace. The Sino-Soviet split. China and the Soviet Union had once been firm allies. The Soviet Union had supported the Chinese Communist Party since its founding and had signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance in 1950. It had given China both money and valuable technical assistance as the latter sought to build its industrial capacity. However, because Mao had greatly admired Stalin, he disapproved of Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of him. He also believed that as China's leader since 1949, he had seniority over Khrushchev, in power only since 1953. In Mao's eyes, he himself, not Khrushchev, should be the leader of world communism. The Sino-Soviet split widened when Khrushchev, fearing Mao's insistence on attacking Taiwan might provoke war with the United States, refused to provide China with nuclear weapons. Khrushchev's actions were representative of Mao's chief criticism of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. The Soviets, Mao believed, had become too comfortable as leaders of the communist world and were no longer willing to risk confrontation with the United States or other imperialist powers if this would jeopardize their position. The USSR was doing too little in the eyes of China to support decolonization struggles in Africa and Asia and wars of independence. Indeed, far from being anti-imperialist, the Soviets had created their own empire in Europe. Other issues contributed to the rift. In the clash between India and China in 1962, for example, the USSR supported India. In 1969, Soviet and Chinese forces clashed in a dispute over their shared border. In the late 1960s, China cut back its financing of North Vietnam's war against the South, and North Vietnam turned to the Soviet Union to fill the gap. The United States was eager to capitalize on the Sino-Soviet split in hopes of securing several advantages. In 1972, Nixon visited China, the first sitting U.S. president to do so, and met with Mao. This effort to improve U.S. relations with China threatened to isolate the Soviet Union. So, in turn, the Soviets agreed to hold a Moscow summit meeting between Brezhnev and Nixon in May 1972. The United States then used the Soviet desire for closer relations to exert pressure on North Vietnam. In March 1972, after the North launched an offensive against the South, Nixon threatened to call off the Moscow summit if the Soviets did not force North Vietnam to the peace table. In the end, the United States' efforts to extricate itself from the war were successful. At the peace talks in Paris, North Vietnam and the United States agreed to the U.S. withdrawal from South Vietnam in 1973. The war continued until 1975, however, when North Vietnam defeated South Vietnam and the country was reunified under a communist government. All told, the war had cost the lives of more than 1 million people. Genocide in Cambodia. Although peace came to Vietnam in 1975, in neighboring Cambodia, a nightmare was just beginning. Throughout much of the war in Vietnam, Cambodia had been neutral. In 1970, however, its ruler Prince Sihanouk was deposed by one of his generals, Lon Nol, who favored the United States. Sihanouk then allied himself with the Cambodian communist group, the Khmer Rouge. In 1975, after years of fighting, the Khmer Rouge overthrew the government of Lon Nol. Under the rule of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge leader and an admirer of Mao Zedong, Cambodia embarked on a program to rebuild itself as the perfect communist state. The Khmer Rouge seized private property and forced city dwellers to relocate to the countryside. The population was made to labor in work camps and on collective farms, and some died as a result of disease and starvation. Those who were unable to work were killed. The Khmer Rouge also carried out a deliberate campaign of extermination against professionals, intellectuals, which could mean anyone who wore glasses, Christians, Muslims, Buddhist monks, and people of Chinese, Thai, and Vietnamese ancestry. By the time the killing ended with the invasion of Cambodia by Vietnam in 1978, some 3 million people, approximately 1/4 of Cambodia's population, had died. Although Southeast Asia remained mired in violence and turmoil, in the West there were new hopes for peace as the Cold War showed signs of thawing. At the 1972 Moscow summit, the United States and the USSR signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, SALT, a mutual agreement to restrict the development of anti-ballistic missiles meant to destroy incoming warheads, thus rendering useless the defense strategy of mutually assured destruction. This marked the beginning of a period of détente, a relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that included trade agreements and additional arms reduction talks. In 1975, the United States and the Soviet Union, along with Canada and all the countries of Europe, except for Albania, signed the Helsinki Accords. The United States and its allies pledged to respect the borders of Eastern Bloc countries and to refrain from intervening in their internal affairs. The Soviet Union promised to respect human rights. Decolonization in Africa in the shadow of the Cold War. Like the Vietnamese, the peoples of Africa also wished to shake off Western control following World War II. The Atlantic Charter, a 1941 agreement by the United Kingdom and the United States regarding their shared goals for the post-war world, had promised self-determination for all, and African countries wanted to make this a reality. In October 1945, the Fifth Pan-African Congress assembled in Manchester, England. Delegates from Europe's African colonies as well as from the Caribbean, the United States, India, Sri Lanka, and Central America called for an end to colonialism. European colonial powers were not of the same mind. Following the devastation of World War II, some regarded the natural resources and markets of African colonies essential to rebuilding their damaged economies. For example, the new constitution granted to Britain's colony of Gold Coast, Ghana, in 1946 reflected the desire of the United Kingdom, like other colonial powers, to retain control over its African possessions. Although Africans were given additional opportunities to elect the members of a legislative council, the council had only advisory capacity. All real power was held by the colony's appointed governor. In August 1947, Ghanaians formed the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, which called on the United Kingdom to make the colony self-governing. Among the founding members of the UGCC was Kwame Nkrumah. In January 1948, Nkrumah and another member of the UGCC addressed a group of Ghanaian ex-service members. Like many in the Gold Coast, they were angry over the government's failure to address problems such as unemployment and inflation, and planned to petition the governor. When riots broke out in the colony a few days later, the government blamed the UGCC and arrested several of its members, including Nkrumah. In 1949, Nkrumah founded his own political party, the Convention People's Party, and in January 1950, he called on his followers to begin a general strike to force the British to allow the drafting of a new constitution. He was jailed again and was in prison when he was elected to office in 1951, in the first election in Africa in which universal suffrage was allowed. Nkrumah became Ghana's prime minister, and on March 6, 1957, Ghana received its independence. Following Ghana, other British colonies also won their independence. In 1944, the Kenya African Union, KAU, was founded to call for Kenya's liberation from British rule, and in 1947, Jomo Kenyatta assumed its leadership. The United Kingdom was unwilling to grant independence to Kenya, a colony in which many whites owned profitable coffee plantations and controlled more land than did black Africans. In 1952, a group called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, popularly known as the Mau Mau, began to fight for independence. The Mau Mau, a nationalist movement among the Kikuyu people, espoused violence as a means to their goal. To spread fear, they attacked civilians, both white and black, burning people to death or killing them with machetes. Africans who remained loyal to the British government were targeted. In response, the United Kingdom banned all Kenyan political parties, including the KAU that did not advocate violence, and struck back at the Mau Mau. Thousands were sent to internment camps. Entire villages were forcibly resettled in new areas, ostensibly to protect them from the Mau Mau. Innocent civilians were killed by forces employed by the British government. By 1956, the uprising had largely been brought to an end. In 1960, the United Kingdom began talks to discuss Kenyan independence, which was granted in 1963. Kenyatta became the country's prime minister. Dueling voices. Violence in Kenya. Kenya was one of many British colonies that sought independence following World War II. There, as in other places in Africa, people were divided over the best means to achieve it. Some, like Kenyan leader Jomo Kenyatta, proposed a peaceful solution. Others, like the members of the Mau Mau, endorsed violence. The attitudes of the two sides are contrasted in the following speech Kenyatta gave in 1952 and in a Mau Mau oath from the same period. I want you to know the purpose of KAU Kenya African Union. It is the biggest purpose the African has. It involves every African in Kenya, and it is their mouthpiece which asks for freedom. KAU is you, and you are the KAU. If we unite now, each and every one of us, and each tribe to another, we will cause the implementation in this country of that which the European calls democracy. True democracy has no color distinction. It does not choose between black and white. We are not worried that other races are here with us in our country, but we insist that we are the leaders here, and what we want we insist we get. We want our cattle to get fat on our land so that our children grow up in prosperity. We do not want that fat removed to feed others. Our country today is in a bad state for its land is full of fools, and fools in a country delay the independence of its people. KAU seeks to remedy this situation, and I tell you now it despises thieving, robbery, and murder, for these practices ruin our country. I say this because if one man steals or two men steal, there are people sitting close by lapping up information who say the whole tribe is bad because a theft has been committed. Those people are wrecking our chances of advancement. They will prevent us getting freedom. If I have my own way, let me tell you I would butcher the criminal, and there are more criminals than one in more senses than one. KAU is not a fighting union that uses fists and weapons. If any of you here think that force is good, I do not agree with you. I do not want people to accuse us falsely, that we steal and that we are Mau Mau. I pray to you that we join hands for freedom, and freedom means abolishing criminality. Jomo Kenyatta, speech at the African Union meeting. I swear before God and before the people who are here that I have today become a soldier of Gikuyu and Mumbai, and I will from now onwards fight the real fight for the land and freedom of our country, till we get it, or till my last drop of blood. Today I have set my first step as a warrior, and I will never retreat. And if I ever retreat, may this soil and all its products be a curse upon me. If ever I am called to accompany a raid or bring in the head of an enemy, I shall obey and never give lame excuses. I will never spy or inform on my people, and if ever sent to spy on our enemies, I will always report the truth. I will never reveal a raid or crime committed to any person who has not taken the Ngero oath and will steal firearms wherever possible. I will never leave a member in difficulty without trying to help him. I will obey the orders of my leaders at all times without any argument or complaint, and will never fail to give them any money or goods taken in a raid, and will never hide any pillages or take them for myself. I will never sell land to any white man, and if I sell, may this soil and all its products be a curse upon me. Donald L. Barnett and Karari Njama, the Mau Mau Warrior Oath. What parts of the Mau Mau Oath would Jomo Kenyatta dislike? Are there parts he might be willing to take himself? Why does Kenyatta reject the tactics of the Mau Mau? Nationalism and the desire for independence were powerful in the colonies of other European countries as well. Some imperial powers attempted moderate changes at first. In 1946, for example, France proposed sweeping reforms for its African colonies. It ended forced labor and racially discriminatory practices and allowed for a degree of self-rule. It did not offer independence, but that was what France's African subjects most wanted and fought for. From 1947 to 1949, the Malagasy Revolt raged in Madagascar, costing thousands of lives. Violence brought an end to colonialism in Cameroon in 1957 as well. In Algeria, warfare lasted from 1954 to 1962, when France granted independence, and more than 1 million people of European descent departed the country. In the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cold War tensions contributed to the violence. When in 1960, Belgium promised the Congolese independence in 30 years, nationalist groups such as the Congolese National Movement and the Alliance of Bakongo responded that they wanted it immediately. Black Congolese held protests that often ended in riots, and they refused to pay taxes. Alarmed, many white residents started citizens, militias, and attacked black residents. Realizing the strength of the nationalist protest, the government of Belgium agreed to grant Congo its independence on June 30, 1960. This did not end the violence, however. When Emile Janssens, the white commander of the Force Publique, the Belgian Congo's security force, made clear to black troops a few days after independence that white officers would remain in charge, soldiers mutinied. Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the Congolese National Movement, who had been elected prime minister, replaced Janssens with a black commander of the renamed National Congolese Army and promoted black soldiers. This was not enough to end the mutiny, however. White people were attacked across the country, and Belgian forces invaded to protect them. In the midst of the chaos, Congo's mineral-rich southern province of Katanga seceded and proclaimed its independence. Lumumba appealed to the UN, which had sent peacekeeping forces to restore order, to end Katanga's secession. The UN refused, however, claiming secession was an internal political matter with which it should not interfere. Lumumba then asked the United States for help, but his request was denied. Finally, he turned to the Soviet Union, which provided weapons and military advisors. Lumumba's acceptance of Soviet support branded him a communist in Western eyes. Taking advantage of the chaos, Colonel Joseph Desiré Mobutu Sese Seko, the new head of the security force, put Lumumba under house arrest and placed Joseph Kasavubu, the leader of the Alliance of Bakongo, in charge of the government. Lumumba was subsequently killed by Katangese troops with the knowledge and support of the CIA, which provided both money and weapons to Mobutu and Kasavubu. British politicians, observing the strength of nationalist fervor not only in Kenya, but also in other colonies, and fearing more violence like that experienced in Congo, moved quickly to liberate British colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. In 1960, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, visited Africa and delivered a speech called The Wind of Change. The wind of change was sweeping Africa, Macmillan declared, and the time of liberation had come, even though white Britons might not want it. Unlike Britain, France, and Belgium, Portugal steadfastly refused to relinquish its colonies. The nationalistic, quasi-fascist government of the Second Portuguese Republic that had first come to power in 1933 regarded them as part of Portugal and considered Portugal to be a guarantor of order and civilization in Africa. A variety of independence movements sprang up in Angola, Portuguese Guinea, now called Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, just as they did elsewhere in Africa. Some groups sought to establish self-government along the lines of Western democracies, while others favored the creation of a communist system. In Angola, Portuguese troops battled the National Liberation Front, FNLA, a largely rural organization comprising Bakongo people, the Marxist People's Movement of Liberation of Angola, MPLA, a largely urban group, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, a rural group made up principally of Ovimbundu people. In Mozambique, the Marxist Mozambique Liberation Front fought for independence. The African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, another Marxist organization, led the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau. The Cold War intruded upon the battle in the Portuguese colonies. The Soviet Union, China, Romania, Cuba, and Yugoslavia all provided aid to the various independence groups. The United States did not because Portugal was a fellow NATO member. In 1974, leftist military officers in Portugal overthrew the government of the Second Portuguese Republic and established a democratic government. The new government ended the war with the African colonies by granting independence to Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, along with Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe, islands off the African coast. Independence did not bring an end to the violence, however. In 1975, civil war broke in Angola for control of the country. The United States provided support for UNITA and FNLA in their struggle against the MPLA. Violence also erupted in the former British colony of Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. Rejecting the British government's plans for majority rule in its former colonies, white residents, unwilling to submit to a government controlled by black Rhodesians, proclaimed independence from the United Kingdom in 1965 with Ian Smith as Prime Minister, a move that Britain opposed. Civil war broke out between the white government and two black nationalist groups, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, and the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe. The Soviet Union lent support to ZAPU and China to ZANU. Eventually, an agreement was reached among all three parties, and the United Kingdom officially recognized Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. Robert Mugabe became prime minister, and thousands of Nkomo's followers were tortured, imprisoned, or killed, until he and Mugabe combined their political parties in 1987. Similar to the situation in Rhodesia, black Africans in South Africa struggled for independence not against a European power, but against white Africans. In 1909, the British Cape Colony, Natal, and the Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State had been combined to form a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Only the white minority had been allowed to rule, however, and the contest for power had been between whites of British and Afrikaner, Dutch, descent. Laws denied black Africans the right to vote and prevented them from laying claim to most of the country's land. They were denied the right to live in some parts of the country, and many were forcibly removed to homelands apart from whites. In 1948, discriminatory practices and racial segregation were formalized in a system called apartheid. In 1950, South Africa's legislature passed the Suppression of Communism Act, which banned not only the anti-apartheid South African Communist Party, but also any actions to end racially discriminatory practices. Thus, when in 1960, the United Kingdom allowed South Africans to vote on whether to remain a dominion, the majority of the population could not participate. In 1961, South Africa officially became a republic, but the true liberation movement was still underway. From its very beginning, groups such as the African National Congress, ANC, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, had fought apartheid with peaceful protest at first. However, following the killing of peaceful protesters in the black township of Sharpeville and the banning of the ANC and PAC, both in 1960, anti-apartheid activists began to employ sabotage and attacks on police and military targets, along with more peaceful tactics like strikes. In 1976, protests erupted in black townships against a new law requiring black African students to learn Afrikaans, the language spoken by South Africa's Dutch colonizers. In the township of Soweto, the police opened fire on schoolchildren, killing more than 100. Over the course of decades, thousands of activists were arrested and imprisoned, including Nelson Mandela, a leader of the ANC, and many were executed. By the 1980s, however, continued opposition to apartheid, economic sanctions imposed by foreign countries, boycotts of South African businesses, and international condemnation had begun to have an effect. In 1991, South Africa officially ended the policy of apartheid. In 1994, the first elections were held in which all South Africans could vote regardless of race. The ANC swept to victory, and the new National Assembly elected Nelson Mandela president. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain why the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc collapsed, discuss the effects of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, describe the changes made by Deng Xiaoping in China in the 1970s and 1980s. At the beginning of the Cold War, ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the United States seemed insurmountable. The enmity between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc resulted in conflicts around the globe that cost the lives of millions of people. Millions also died in China's pursuit of the ideal communist society. Nuclear weapons that threatened the very existence of the human species were stockpiled in preparation for a war that neither side wanted. A world that was not so deeply divided seemed unimaginable to many. However, the Cold War lasted less than 50 years. The collapse of communism, the Eastern Bloc, the Cold War had begun in Greece, an unlikely place. Its last shot was also fired in an unlikely place, Afghanistan, the site of the final proxy war waged between the allies of the Soviet Union and those of the United States. In 1973, the nationalist Mohammad Sardar Daoud Khan, once the Prime Minister of Afghanistan from 1953 to 1963, came to power again in that country after deposing its king. He was originally backed by the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, which received support from the Soviet Union. Not all factions of the PDPA supported Daoud, however. When he failed to reconcile the factions and realized he was losing the support of PDPA members who had helped him to power, he turned to the United States for support. He wished to free Afghanistan from dependence on the Soviet Union, which had extended assistance to the country in the past, and he reasoned that the United States would help. He also sought closer relations with U.S. allies Saudi Arabia and Iran and expelled Soviet military and economic advisors from the country. In 1978, Daoud was overthrown and killed by one of the PDPA factions, as the victors sought to eliminate their enemies, a group of Islamic fundamentalists who opposed secular and Western influences on Islamic societies and endorsed strict codes of behavior fought back against government attempts to spread communism to tribal areas. When it became clear that the PDPA leader favored by Moscow could not maintain control of the country and a pro-US rival was gaining ascendancy, the Soviet Union sent ground troops to invade Afghanistan in December 1979. President Jimmy Carter protested the Soviet incursion and imposed economic sanctions. The United States also continued arming the Islamist enemies of the pro-Soviet Afghan regime, a policy it had been following for some time. These Islamist insurgents, called the Mujahideen, Arabic, for Muslims who battle non-Muslims on behalf of Islam, regarded the Afghan government and the Soviet Union as enemies of religion and waged a guerrilla war against them. The Soviet Union fought the various groups of Mujahideen for 10 years without coming close to victory. It spent the equivalent of billions of dollars and lost some 15,000 soldiers. About 2 million Afghans were killed. Among the groups of Mujahideen who fought the Soviets were young men from the Pashtun tribe who had studied at Islamic religious schools in Pakistan. They were supported by both the CIA and its Pakistani equivalent, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, and were called the Taliban, meaning student, in the Pashtun tribal language of Pashto. Following the withdrawal of the Soviets, various groups of Mujahideen battled for control of Afghanistan, with the Taliban eventually emerging victorious. The stability and order their rule offered was welcomed by many Afghans after the long years of chaos. Although the United States offered the Mujahideen support to combat the Soviets in Afghanistan, it found itself the enemy of another group of Islamic fundamentalists, this time in Iran. Since the 1950s, the United States had provided funds and weapons to the leader of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. With U.S. aid, the Shah had built one of the largest armies in the Middle East and SAVAK, one of the most feared secret police forces. He allowed no dissent, and the secret police spied upon, arrested, and tortured anyone suspected of opposing him. The Shah's efforts to modernize and westernize Iran by granting women the right to vote, outlawing their wearing of veils, and providing them equal opportunities for education angered many traditionalist Muslim religious leaders. They also disliked the messages contained in the Western movies and music the Shah had allowed into Iran. In contrast, although liberal Iranians approved of these actions, they disliked the lack of political freedom. Nearly all Iranians resented the enormous wealth the Shah and his closest friends had amassed as a result of U.S. assistance. The Shah had few supporters. One of his most outspoken critics was the Shiite religious leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Despite being repeatedly arrested, Khomeini continued to criticize both the Shah and his patron, the U.S. government. In 1964, Khomeini was expelled from Iran. This did not end his influence, however, and tape-recorded messages from him encouraging opposition to the Shah were smuggled into the country. Beginning in 1977, Khomeini exhorted Iranians to go on strike and refuse to pay their taxes. In 1978, waves of protests and strikes by government and oil industry workers were punished with attacks by government forces. Each was followed by a larger wave of protest. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and his family fled the country, and 2 weeks later Ayatollah Khomeini returned. He was greeted enthusiastically by the vast majority of Iranians, and in mid-February 1979, Shapur Bakhshir, the prime minister appointed by the Shah, was replaced by Mehdi Bazargan, selected by Khomeini. In December 1979, the Iranian people voted to adopt a constitution making the country an Islamic republic. Islam became the nation's official religion, and the constitution ordained that all laws passed must conform to Islamic law. On October 22, 1979, the Shah entered the United States for medical treatment. Many Iranians feared this meant Washington was about to take steps to return him to power. On November 4, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in the Iranian capital of Tehran and took its staff and Marine Guards hostage, demanding the Shah be returned to Iran for trial and execution, Figure 14. 19. Their actions were widely supported within Iran, including by Khomeini, which led the moderate prime minister to resign. Although female and African American hostages were released within a few days, the others were held for 444 days, to be set free on January 20, 1981, the day President Carter left office. A photograph shows two men in front of a crowd. They both have one first in the air and hold on to a gun in the other hand. They both yell. Behind them is a large group of men, some waving their hands in the air, some yelling, and some holding various weapons. There is a large banner with Persian script hanging across a building behind them, as well as other smaller banners. Figure 14. 19 Iranian Revolution. Protesters outside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979 hold a banner that reads, "Long live anti-imperialism and democratic forces." Credit, Iranian Revolution by Ana News/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Fearing that Iraqi Shiites would be radicalized by events in neighboring Iran, the Sunni-dominated government of Iraq, controlled by the Socialist Ba'ath Party, sent its troops to invade Iran. Iraq also hoped to resolve long-standing border disputes between the two nations and replace Iran as the dominant nation in the region, which had not been possible when Iran was receiving U.S. military and economic support. The United States provided economic and technological support to Iraq. The Iran-Iraq War ended in August 1988 with a ceasefire arranged by the United Nations and no real gains by either side. Despite its support of Iraq in its war against Iran, the chief concern of the United States in the 1980s was not violence in the Middle East, but the destruction of communism. Jimmy Carter was followed in office by President Ronald Reagan, who considered the Soviet Union an evil empire and vowed to eliminate communism. He believed the United States should negotiate with the Soviets to ensure world peace, but should do so from a position of strength. To this end, he ordered a buildup of the country's abilities to fight both a conventional and a nuclear war. His successor in office, George H.W. Bush, continued those efforts. In their own words, "An evil empire." In a speech delivered in March 1983, President Ronald Reagan called for peace with the Soviet Union, but on U.S. terms. Specifically, Reagan said he would not agree to arms limitation talks until the United States was equal to the Soviet Union in military capacity. In his speech, he described the contest between the two countries as one between good and evil. I intend to do everything I can to persuade the Soviet Union of our peaceful intent. At the same time, however, they must be made to understand. We will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedom. We will never abandon our belief in God. Yes, let us pray for the salvation of all of those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. Like other dictators before them, they're always making their final territorial demand. Some would have us accept them at their word and accommodate ourselves to their aggressive impulses. But if history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. Ronald Reagan, Evil Empire Speech. Why does Reagan use religious language? What effect does this have? To what other country is he comparing the Soviet Union when he talks about simple-minded appeasement? Do you think this is a good comparison? Why or why not? When the new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985, discontent was simmering in the Soviet Union and in the countries of Eastern Europe. Shortages of food and other goods were making people angry. In Poland in 1980, shipyard workers under the leadership of labor activist Lech Walesa formed a trade union and went on strike to protest government policies. Within a year, 1/3 of Poland's population had joined the Solidarity Union. The Polish government tried to suppress the movement and ban the union, but its 10 million members could not be silenced. Pope John Paul II, himself a Pole and an opponent of communism, called upon the Polish Church to support the workers. Gorbachev realized the need for reform in the Soviet Union. The country simply could not afford to both compete militarily with the United States and provide its citizens what they needed to lead decent lives. Gorbachev thus willingly entered into arms limitation talks with Reagan. He also began a program of perestroika, a restructuring of the Soviet state and economy. He cut military spending and encouraged the beginnings of private enterprise. As part of his reform efforts, Gorbachev also encouraged glasnost or openness, allowing those who were angry to be critical of the government. Changes in the Soviet Union mirrored changes taking place elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc. In 1988, protests broke out again in Poland, and strikes swept the country. The Polish government was forced to negotiate with Solidarity leaders and make concessions to them, including free elections for some government offices. In 1989, Hungary and East Germany opened their borders, allowing their citizens to come and go freely. Berliners climbed atop the wall that divided their city and began to tear it down. People in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia called for changes in their government as well. Soviet tanks did not roll through the streets, and troops did not arrest or fire upon protesters. Gorbachev informed other members of the Soviet government that he did not intend to use military might to maintain control of Eastern Europe. In 1990, Germany was reunified, and the capital was returned to Berlin. But the reforms Gorbachev initiated to save the Soviet Union eventually tore it apart. The Soviet republics also wanted their independence. Advocates of reform and democracy pushed for greater change. Not everyone in the Soviet Union was pleased by the reforms taking place, though. In August 1991, conservative members of the Communist Party attempted to remove Gorbachev from power, only to be foiled by the actions of Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. Acting together, Yeltsin and the presidents of the Soviet republics of Belarus and Ukraine voted in December 1991 to dissolve the Soviet Union. The Cold War was at an end. Ironically, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc also meant the demise of Yugoslavia, which had tried so hard to stand apart from it. The need to present a united front to the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact nations had served as a powerful glue binding together the many disparate ethnic groups and states that comprised Yugoslavia. Had Tito lived, the country might have remained unified for a while longer, but he died in May 1980. In 1991, the states of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina declared their independence from Yugoslavia. When Serbian minorities in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina and Albanians in the Serbian province of Kosovo attempted to proclaim their independence from these larger states, violence broke out. Slobodan Milošević, the former president of both the state of Serbia and of Yugoslavia, funded Serb rebels in Bosnia and conducted a genocidal campaign against the Albanians of Kosovo. He was indicted for war crimes by the United Nations in 2001 and died in prison in 2006. Link to learning. The Soviet Union no longer exists. However, whether Russia has become a democratic country is a matter for debate. Read about efforts to establish democracy in Russia at the Freedom House website. The retreat of communism. China. The excesses of the Cultural Revolution in China spelled the end of both Mao Zedong's power and, ironically, the Chinese Revolution. By the time of Lin Biao's death in 1971, China had suffered badly. The economy was in shambles. The government had difficulty fulfilling basic functions. As Mao retreated into depression and ill health, his role was increasingly taken over by the Gang of Four, consisting of Mao's wife Jiang Qing, his chosen successor Wang Hongwen, Zhang Chengqiao, and Yao Wenyuan. However, they were primarily concerned with ensuring ideological purity and the continuation of revolutionary political thought. Crucial matters, such as the economy, were left in the hands of Premier Zhou Enlai. Zhou, however, was dying of cancer and needed help, so with Mao's permission he returned Deng Xiaoping to power to assist him, figure 14. 20. Zhou and Deng managed the government and the economy, with more of the work falling to Deng as Zhou withdrew from public life. Following Zhou's death in January 1976, the Gang of Four managed to oust Deng Xiaoping from power once more. But this time, he did not remain away for long. A photograph shows three men standing outside behind a podium with microphones. The man on the far left holds a paper and pen in his hand and looks to the man in the center. The man in the center stands behind the podium and looks at the camera. Behind him stands another man who also looks forward. Figure 14. 20. Deng Xiaoping. In 1977, Deng Xiaoping returned to a place of prominence in the Chinese government after being ousted from power during the Cultural Revolution. In this photo, President Carter welcomes him to the White House in 1979. Credit: Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter at the arrival ceremony for the Vice Premier of China by U.S. National Archives and Records Administration / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Following Mao's death on September 9, 1976, his successor Hua Guofeng had the Gang of Four arrested, and Deng returned to power. Deng was made vice premier in 1977 and used his position to reverse the mistakes of the Cultural Revolution. In 1978, he replaced Hua as leader of China and argued that the country needed to focus on modernizing and building its economy instead of continuing to pursue revolution by following the teachings of Mao. He instituted a policy of Baluan Fanzhang, correct the wrong return to normal, in which the reputations of those imprisoned were rehabilitated, and those still alive were returned to power. The Chinese system of higher education returned to normal as Deng reinstated entrance examinations, which had been suspended during the Cultural Revolution. He declared that scientists and intellectuals were deserving of respect because modernization could not proceed without their contributions. Deng also instituted a sweeping set of economic reforms based on the four modernizations of agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. Collective farms were broken up, and entrepreneurs encouraged to start their own businesses. The country was opened to foreign investment, and foreign companies were invited to open Chinese branches. In the 1980s and 1990s, a few elements of capitalism were introduced. Private management of many state industries was allowed, and although the largest remained under government control, people's incomes and the Chinese standard of living swiftly improved. Along with economic changes, alterations took place in foreign policy. In the 1980s, China decreased its support for revolutionary activity in other countries, with some exceptions, such as its support for anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan and for Cambodians fighting the Vietnamese invasion. Beginning in the late 1980s, Relations with the Soviet Union also began to improve, and trade between the USSR and China increased. In 1980, Deng called for political reform as well. He criticized the cumbersome Chinese bureaucracy and called for term limits on political positions and a redrafting of the constitution. However, he had no intention of allowing opposition to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. In 1986, university students began a series of protests in major Chinese cities. The government suppressed their actions, but in 1989 protests broke out again. Beginning on April 17, students in Beijing gathered at Tiananmen Square to mourn the recent death of party official Hu Yaobang, who had supported them. Influenced by Western media, they called for democratic reform, an end to government censorship, greater rights to protest, and more money for education. They and other protesters also decried corruption in the CCP and what they perceived as mismanagement of China's economy. Reforms had improved life for farmers, but industrial workers and urban dwellers had not benefited. In the coming weeks, some students marched through the streets in angry protest, while others refused to abandon the square. On the evening of June 3, 1989, tanks entered Beijing, and over the next several days, armed troops and tanks cleared the square, killing anywhere from several hundred to several thousand people. On June 9, Deng denounced the students for attempting to overthrow the government. In other Chinese cities, the protests ended peacefully.